The snow fell so softly that winter, it seemed to muffle the whole broken world. Deep in the Ardennes forest, where ancient pine trees reached like dark spires into a pale, endless sky, a profound and heavy quiet had settled over the earth. It was a beautiful, terrible kind of quiet. The kind of silence that makes you want to hold your breath, just to listen to the snowflakes landing lightly on the frozen ground. For the young men gathered beneath the heavy, white-laden branches, this quiet was a rare and precious gift. They had been told this was a place to rest, a quiet sector, a forgotten corner of the war where nothing much ever happened, and nothing much ever would. They called it the Ghost Front. The name sounded haunting, but to the boys shivering in their woolen coats, it was a comfort. Ghosts were memories, whispers of the past, and here, in the deep freeze of December, the present moment felt peacefully still. Imagine a young boy, barely 19, sitting on a wooden crate just outside a small, sandbag dugout. Let us call him James. He was from a place where the sun baked the earth golden and warm, a place of dust and cicadas and endless summer afternoons. Now, he sat wrapped in blankets that smelled of damp wool and wood smoke, watching his own breath turn to white vapor in the frigid air. He had never seen snow like this before. Back home, a light dusting was a miracle that melted by noon. But here, the snow was an ocean. It covered the hills, weighed down the branches, and buried the narrow, winding dirt roads until the landscape looked like a smooth, untouched canvas. James pulled his thin gloves tighter and held a crumpled piece of paper close to the fading light of a small, carefully shielded fire. He was writing to his mother. He did not write about fear, or about the enemy, or about the great, churning machinery of a world at war. He wrote about the cold. He wrote about the way the frost looked like tiny diamonds scattered across the hood of a Jeep. He asked if the dog was still sleeping by the stove, and if the neighbor's roof had finally been patched. He wrote to bridge the impossible distance between the frozen, silent woods and the warm kitchen of his childhood. Around him, the forest was slowly going to sleep. Men moved with a quiet, deliberate slowness, trying to conserve their warmth, trying not to disturb the profound stillness of the evening. In another foxhole, not far away, two older men shared a single, battered tin cup of coffee. The water had been heated over a tiny, smokeless stove, and the coffee itself was bitter and weak, but as they passed the warm tin back and forth, it felt like the greatest luxury in the world. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The simple, shared warmth of the cup against their palms, the brief brush of a shoulder against a shoulder in the cramped, earthen space, these were the small, quiet languages of survival and brotherhood. They were tired. So deeply, profoundly tired. Some had marched through autumn mud and endless rains to get here, their boots heavy with the weight of the miles. Others were entirely new, fresh-faced and unsure, dropped into this silent, white world with uniforms that still felt too stiff and helmets that felt too heavy. But the forest did not care who was a veteran and who was a boy. The forest simply offered its quiet embrace, draping them all in the same gentle, falling snow. As twilight deepened, the gray sky bruised into a dark, rich indigo. The trunks of the pine trees turned to solid black silhouettes against the pale snow. There is a specific kind of peace that comes over a camp when the light finally goes. The busy work of the day, the cleaning of gear, the chopping of firewood, the quiet murmurs of shared stories, fades away into the necessity of sleep. Men curled together beneath shelter halves, layering their coats and blankets, pulling their collars up over their noses to trap whatever fragile heat their bodies could make. In these quiet, dark hours, the mind wanders. It drifts away from the frozen earth and travels back across oceans. A man named Arthur lay on his back, staring up through the pine needles at a single, cold star. He thought of his wife, of the way her hair smelled like vanilla and rain, of the soft, worn cotton of her favorite dress. He could almost feel the phantom weight of her hand resting on his chest. It was a memory so vivid, so warm, that for a moment, he forgot the biting cold seeping through his boots. He held onto that memory delicately, the way one holds a fragile bird, afraid that if he moved too quickly, it would startle and fly away. This was the everyday heroism of the Ardennes. It was not the grand, sweeping bravery of statues and history books. It was the quiet, invisible resilience of a heart choosing to remember love in the middle of a frozen wilderness. It was the strength to endure the creeping ache of the cold, hour by hour, drawing comfort from the steady, rhythmic breathing of a friend sleeping nearby. The night deepened. The snow continued to fall, a gentle, hypnotic curtain of white that erased the footprints of the day. The world felt infinitely small, reduced to the few feet of darkness around a foxhole, the smell of damp earth, and the faint, sweet scent of pine sap. But a forest is a living thing, and it knows when the wind is about to change. Sometime in the deepest, darkest part of the night, when the cold was at its absolute sharpest, the absolute silence began to feel strange. It was no longer the peaceful, resting silence of a sleeping world. It became a heavy, waiting silence. The kind of stillness that precedes a great shift in the weather. James, the boy from the warm south, stirred in his sleep. He felt it before he heard it. A vibration, subtle and deep, humming through the frozen roots of the trees and into the icy ground beneath his back. It was like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant, slow and low, rhythmic and unsettling. He opened his eyes. The sky above was a starless void of gray clouds. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the air brittle and clear. He sat up slowly, his joints stiff, his breath pluming in the dark. Beside him, an older soldier named Miller was already awake. Miller was kneeling at the edge of the dugout, perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, listening. James opened his mouth to ask a question, to break the tension, but Miller simply raised a heavy, gloved hand. A silent plea. Just listen. And so, James listened. At first, there was only the wind, brushing through the upper branches of the pines with a soft, shushing sound. But beneath the wind, carried on the frigid air from somewhere far away, came a new sound. It was a murmur, low and unbroken. It sounded like thunder, but it was too steady, too relentless to be a storm. It was a mechanical growl, deep and guttural, rolling over the distant, snow-covered hills. It was the sound of heavy iron shifting in the dark. The sound of engines coughing to life in the freezing mist. The sound of thousands of boots crunching in unison upon the crusted snow. The ghost front was waking up. A profound, quiet dread began to seep into the forest, colder than the winter air. The men in the foxholes began to stir, shaken from their dreams of warm kitchens and soft hands. They sat up in the dark, looking at one another with wide, shadowed eyes. No one shouted. No one panicked. There was only a slow, dawning realization settling over them like a heavy blanket. The peace they had been promised, the quiet rest they had so deeply craved, was an illusion. The winter had been hiding a secret deep within its white embrace. James looked out into the dense, black tree line. A few hours ago, those trees had been a protective wall, a quiet sanctuary. Now, the spaces between the trunks seemed deeper, darker, filled with unseen movement. The distant rumble grew slightly louder, a slow, inevitable tide creeping closer through the valleys and over the ridges. Miller reached out and gently placed a hand on James's shoulder. It was a small, deeply human gesture. A silent communication of shared fear, but also of shared resolve. "We are here," the touch said. "We are together." The cold night stretched out before them, vast and uncertain, as the distant, rolling thunder continued to echo through the pines. The shadows in the Ardennes were stretching, reaching out through the frost and the fog, as the unsuspecting forest waited for the dawn, and the quiet men in the snow prepared to face the storm that was coming to meet them in the dark. There is a particular kind of silence that falls when the last door to the outside world is gently, but firmly, pulled shut. In the heart of the winter forest, the town of Bastogne had always been a place of comings and goings. For centuries, it was a warm, beating heart where cobblestone roads met and crossed like the spokes of a great, ancient wheel. Travelers would pass through, leaving behind the echoes of cartwheels and the murmur of distant voices. It was a town of sturdy stone houses with sloped roofs, where chimney smoke curled lazily into the gray sky, and the smell of baking bread and damp earth usually lingered in the air. But as the deep December freeze took hold, the lifeblood of those roads began to slow. The endless, reassuring rumble of friendly trucks, which had hummed a steady lullaby for weeks, began to fade away into the swallowing snow. At first, the isolation did not arrive all at once. It was not a sudden slamming of a gate, but a creeping, quiet shadow that stretched across the fields and through the pine valleys. One by one, the ribbons of road leading north, then east, then south, simply vanished into the white mist. They were swallowed by the shifting lines of the unseen horizon. The people of the town, and the weary young men in olive wool who had come to protect it, slowly realized that the horizon was shrinking. Imagine an old woman, Marie, standing by the frosted glass of her kitchen window. She wipes away a circle of condensation with the sleeve of her thick, woolen sweater. For days, she had watched the farm carts and military jeeps hurry past her front gate. But today, the road is an untouched blanket of white. There are no tire tracks. There are no footprints. The wind hums a low, lonely note through the bare branches of the oak tree in her yard. She goes to her pantry, opening the heavy wooden door, and looks at the small sack of potatoes and the few glass jars of preserved summer plums. She touches the cool glass of a jar, feeling the memory of sunlight trapped inside. She does not panic. The people of this land are used to the harshness of winter. Instead, she quietly calculates. She knows she must make the flour last. She knows she must share the warmth of her hearth with the strangers who are gathering in the streets outside. Those strangers were boys, really. Young men who had been hastily pulled from their quiet camps and ordered into the freezing wind. They drifted into the town in small, exhausted groups. Their shoulders were slumped under the weight of damp canvas packs, their cheeks flushed red from the biting frost, and their eyes heavy with a profound, aching need for sleep. They did not look like the invincible conquerors from the newsreels. They looked like sons who had stayed out too long in the snow and lost their way home. As the ring around Bastogne gently but entirely closed, a strange and beautiful transformation occurred within the town. The boundaries between the soldiers and the civilians began to melt away, dissolving like snowflakes on a warm palm. Houses that had kept their doors tightly shut against the draft now slowly opened them. In a dimly lit cellar beneath a bakery, the air was thick with the smell of old stone and unbaked yeast. A young soldier named Thomas sat on the cold floor, his back resting against a wooden barrel. His boots were soaked through, and he lacked the energy to even try and take them off. Across the dim, flickering light of a single tallow candle, a local family huddled together on a makeshift bed of blankets and straw. A little boy, perhaps 6 years old, watched Thomas with wide, curious eyes. Thomas reached into his heavy, woolen coat. His fingers were stiff and clumsy, numb from a long walk through the freezing woods. Deep in his pocket, he found a small, bruised piece of chocolate, wrapped in crumpled foil. It was his last piece, saved for a moment when the cold became too much to bear. Slowly, he held it out toward the boy. No words were spoken. The language of the soldiers and the language of the townspeople were different, but in the quiet dark of the cellar, words were unnecessary. The boy's mother offered a gentle, tired nod of permission. The child stepped forward, his small shoes scuffing softly against the stone floor, and took the chocolate. In return, the mother handed Thomas a battered tin mug filled with warm, weak broth. As Thomas wrapped his freezing hands around the heated metal, closing his eyes against the soothing warmth, he felt a sudden, sharp ache in his throat. It was the ache of gratitude, the profound comfort of being cared for by a stranger in the dark. Above ground, the snow continued its gentle, relentless descent. It covered the roofs, it softened the sharp edges of the stone walls, and it buried the cobblestones under a thick, silencing quilt. The town was becoming an island. The fields and forests surrounding it were no longer safe passages, they were walls of white, hiding a shifting, encircling presence. The soldiers set up their quiet defenses. They dug into the frozen earth at the edges of the town, their shovels scraping softly against the frost. They moved with a hushed reverence, as if afraid to wake the storm that hovered just beyond the tree line. They shared their meager rations, splitting a single biscuit 3 ways, passing a canteen of half-frozen water down the line. In these quiet moments of waiting, isolation is not just a physical barrier, it becomes a state of mind. When the roads are cut, the mind tries to travel where the body cannot. In a makeshift command post set up in a darkened parlor, a young radio operator sat with his heavy headphones pressed to his ears. The room smelled of old dust and the ozone of the radio tubes. He turned the dial slowly, delicately, listening through the static for a friendly voice, a signal from the outside world. But there was only the hiss and crackle of the winter storm, the sound of empty air. He was a boy who used to build radios in his garage back in a sunny, seaside town, marveling at how invisible waves could connect him to far-off cities. Now, those waves were swallowed by the snow. He took off the headphones, rubbing his tired eyes, and looked at the grandfather clock standing silent in the corner. Time itself seemed to have stopped. Without a way out, the men turned inward. They found scraps of paper, the backs of old envelopes, the margins of torn maps, and they began to write. By the weak light of a shaded lantern, a medic named William rested a piece of paper on his knee. He was writing to his wife. He knew, with a quiet certainty, that no mail truck would be leaving Bastogne tomorrow. He knew the letter might sit in his pocket for days, or weeks, or forever. But the act of writing was a tether, a way of holding on to the world beyond the snow. He didn't write about the fact that they were surrounded. He didn't write about the dwindling bandages in his medical kit or the low rumble of thunder that occasionally echoed from the distant hills. He wrote, instead, about the beauty of the frost on the window panes. He wrote about the kindness of the townspeople and how the smell of a wood fire in a stranger's home had reminded him of their own fireplace. He poured all his love, all his quiet fears, and all his hopes into the blue ink scratching across the page. When he was done, he folded it carefully, a tiny square of immense gravity, and tucked it into his breast pocket, close to his beating heart. It was a shield made of paper and memory. As the first night of the true siege settled over Bastogne, a profound stillness fell upon the island of stone. The blackout curtains were drawn tight, turning the town into a shadow against the glowing white of the snow. No light escaped to guide the watchers in the woods. Inside the cellars, the barns, and the darkened living rooms, soldiers and civilians breathed the same cold air. They listened to the wind rattling the window frames. They watched the shadows dance on the walls as their candles burned lower. The ring had closed. The world outside had faded away, leaving only the immediate, fragile present. The grand strategies of generals, the arrows drawn on vast maps in warm rooms hundreds of miles away, meant nothing here. Here, there was only the cold, the snow, and the steady, quiet heartbeat of a town holding its breath. They were cut off from the earth, adrift in a sea of winter. But as they pulled their thin blankets tighter and leaned their shoulders against one another for warmth, they found a different kind of connection. They were entirely isolated, yes, but in that isolation, they were absolutely, unshakably together. The long, desperate vigil had begun, not with a shout, but with a whisper, as the snow kept falling, slowly burying the roads that once led home. When the world outside turns entirely to ice, the smallest spark of human warmth becomes a saving grace. In the trapped and quiet town, the winter did not just fall upon the rooftops, it seeped through the very stones. It was a cold that did not announce itself with a howling wind, but rather crept in silently beneath the heavy oak doors and through the invisible cracks in the mortar. It was a heavy, settling frost that laid its pale hands over everything it touched. Inside the houses, the hearths had long since gone dark, the firewood carefully rationed and then, eventually, exhausted. The people of the town, and the young soldiers who now shared their parlors and their basements, found themselves living in a world of shadows and shivering breaths. If you were to walk through those dim, narrow hallways, you would see the winter written on the windows. The frost no longer simply rested on the outside of the glass, pushed there by the weather. It had begun to bloom on the inside, delicate, intricate ferns of ice spun from the very breath of the people huddled in the rooms. Every exhale, every whispered prayer, every soft sigh of exhaustion drifted up to the window panes and froze, creating a beautiful, terrible tapestry of silver ice. It was a fragile record of life in a place that felt entirely forgotten by the sun. Beneath the streets, in the vaulted, stone cellars that once held sweet summer wines and aging cheeses, a different kind of quiet settled. These damp, subterranean rooms had become sanctuaries. They were makeshift homes, and more importantly, they were makeshift hospitals. In one such cellar, lit only by the trembling, golden glow of a single hurricane lamp, the air was thick with the scent of damp wool, old dust, and the metallic, quiet scent of the wounded. Here lay the boys who had met the storm head-on. They were wrapped in whatever could be found, heavy canvas shelter halves, colorful knitted Afghans borrowed from the homes above, and old, moth-eaten coats. Among them moved a medic named Julian. Julian was a quiet young man with gentle hands and eyes that had seen far too much over the last few days. He knelt on the hard flagstones beside a low cot, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that went straight to his bones. He opened his canvas medical bag, the worn fabric soft under his numb fingers. He did not need the light to tell him what he already knew. The small, glass vials were empty. The neat rolls of white cotton bandages were gone. The magical powders that kept infection at bay had run out 2 nights ago. There is a profound, aching helplessness that washes over a healer when the tools of healing are taken away. Julian looked down at his empty hands, the hands that were supposed to fix things, to make the pain stop. But as he looked up into the face of the young soldier lying before him, he realized that medicine is not the only thing that heals. The boy on the cot was named Arthur. He was barely old enough to shave, and right now, he was shivering violently, lost in the confusing haze of a fever. He was calling out, his voice a dry, reedy whisper, asking for a mother who was an ocean away. Julian did not have a pill to bring down the fever. He did not have a needle to dull the ache. So, he offered the only thing he had left. He offered his presence. Julian took off his own heavy, woolen gloves, his fingers instantly protesting the biting cold of the cellar. He reached out and took Arthur's trembling hand in his own. He held it firmly, skin against skin, anchoring the boy to the waking world. With his other hand, Julian gently brushed the damp, matted hair away from Arthur's forehead. "I'm here," Julian whispered, his voice low and steady, a soft baritone in the echoing dark. "You're not alone, Arthur. Just rest. I'm right here." He sat like that for hours, ignoring the ache in his own knees, ignoring the gnawing hunger in his own stomach. He became a human shield against the dark, a quiet guardian watching over a fragile sleep. And slowly, the shivering began to subside. The simple, profound weight of another human being sitting beside him, holding his hand, told Arthur that he was safe. In a world that had been torn apart by noise and iron, that quiet touch was a miracle. Across the cellar, the townspeople moved like gentle ghosts among the resting soldiers. They had lost their homes to the troops, their pantries to the hungry, and their safety to the siege, yet they gave what little they had left with a quiet, heartbreaking grace. An older woman, Madame Celine, walked softly down the rows of wounded. She carried a heavy wooden bucket filled with snow she had carefully gathered from the sheltered steps of the cellar entrance. Over a tiny, sheltered flame, she had melted the snow until it was just warm enough to take the chill off. Over her arm hung strips of soft, worn linen, tears from her own cherished bedsheets, the ones she had received as a wedding gift so many years ago. She knelt beside a soldier whose face was dark with the soot and soil of the forest. He watched her with wide, exhausted eyes as she dipped a square of linen into the warm water, wringing it out with practiced, gentle hands. "Hush now," she murmured in French, a language the boy did not speak, but entirely understood. The tone was the universal cadence of a mother's comfort. She began to wash his face. She wiped away the grime of the long march, the dirt of the foxholes, the shadow of the winter. She moved the cloth carefully over his cheeks, down the bridge of his nose, and across his tired brow. With every stroke, she seemed to wash away a little bit of the war. For a few brief minutes, he was not a soldier trapped in a frozen town. He was just a boy, being cared for, being made clean and warm. He closed his eyes, and a single, silent tear slipped down his newly washed cheek, catching the amber light of the lantern before it fell onto the coarse wool of his blanket. Celine did not say a word. She simply reached out with her thumb and wiped the tear away, her touch as light as a falling leaf. This was how they survived the endless, frozen nights. They survived on the thin, durable threads of human kindness. In a corner of the crypt, a small group of men huddled together around a single, precious candle. They were sharing the very last of their rations, a single, hard biscuit and a tin of cold, preserved fruit. They passed the tin in a circle, each man taking only a tiny sip of the sweet syrup, making sure there was exactly enough for the man next to him. They didn't speak of the hunger. They spoke of home. One soldier, a quiet man who usually kept to himself, pulled a folded, creased photograph from the breast pocket of his uniform. The edges were worn soft from being handled 1,000 times. He held it close to the candle, letting the warm light fall on the black and white image. It was a picture of a wide front porch, a swinging wooden bench, and a smiling woman holding a small, laughing dog. He didn't pass the picture around, it was too precious, too fragile to leave his hands. But he described it. He spoke in a low, gentle whisper, painting the scene for the men in the dark. He described the way the honeysuckle smelled in the late days of August. He described the creak of the porch swing, the warm breeze off the fields, the way the sun felt on his shoulders as he sat on the steps. The men listened, their eyes half closed, letting his words transport them out of the freezing cellar. They let themselves believe, just for a moment, that they could smell the sweet flowers, that they could feel the summer sun. The memory became a shared blanket, wrapping around them, providing a warmth that the unyielding stone walls could never offer. Above them, the night sky was vast and indifferent, dropping its endless curtain of snow. Occasionally, the deep, muffled thud of distant artillery would vibrate through the ceiling, dislodging a tiny shower of dust from the ancient stone arches. But down here, in the quiet dark, the sounds of the struggle seemed far away. The cellar was a world unto itself, a fragile bubble of humanity holding its breath against the cold. The heroism here was not loud or boastful. It was the heroism of endurance. It was the quiet courage of a medic holding a hand when there was no medicine left to give. It was the grace of a woman tearing her own linens to bandage a stranger. It was the strength of a young man sharing his last sip of fruit syrup, and the bravery of remembering a summer porch in the depths of a frozen winter. As the long night stretched toward an unseen dawn, the breath of the sleeping men continued to rise in the frigid air. It drifted toward the small, barred windows high up on the cellar walls. And there, against the freezing glass, it settled. It froze into delicate, crystalline patterns, layering upon itself hour after hour. To anyone looking from the outside, the frosted windows simply meant that the cold had won, that the town was entirely encased in ice. But to the people inside, that frost meant something entirely different. Every icy feather, every frozen fern on the glass, was a testament to the life that still stubbornly glowed within. It was the physical proof that hearts were still beating, that lungs were still drawing air, that despite the isolation and the freezing dark, they were still there. They were still breathing. And as long as they had breath to fog the freezing glass, they had hope. They had each other. And in the deepest, darkest heart of the winter, that quietly shared warmth was enough to carry them through to the morning. Even in the quietest corners of a broken world, a single whispered word can change the direction of the wind. Far to the south of the frozen Ardennes, tucked into the rolling, muddy valleys and quiet farming villages of France, an entire army was trying to catch its breath. For these men, the war had momentarily slowed to a gentle, weary rhythm. They had marched across continents, they had waded through autumn rains, and now, finally, they believed they had found a place to rest for the winter. The air here was cold, a damp, heavy chill that sank into the wool of their coats, but it was not the bitter, killing freeze of the deep forests to the north. It was the kind of weather that made a small fire in a rusted barrel feel like the center of the universe. Imagine a camp spread out across a harvested field, beneath a sky the color of old silver. The tents were heavy with rain, the canvas sagging slightly, smelling of wet earth and wood smoke. Inside these dimly lit fabric sanctuaries, men were engaged in the quiet, sacred rituals of living. They were not soldiers in these moments, they were just tired boys, far from home, trying to carve out a tiny piece of comfort in the mud. In one tent, a young man named Samuel sat cross-legged on his olive-drab blanket. He had spent the last 2 hours carefully, meticulously cleaning his boots, scraping away the hardened clay of previous weeks. Beside him, his only extra pair of socks hung over a piece of twine, slowly drying in the ambient warmth of a small kerosene heater. He was humming a psalm under his breath, a gentle melody his grandmother used to play on the piano on Sunday afternoons. For Samuel, and for thousands like him, the day was defined entirely by these small victories: dry feet, a warm cup of coffee, and the beautiful, unbroken silence of a peaceful horizon. They believed they would stay here. They believed they would see the new year arrive in these quiet valleys, sharing stories and waiting for the spring thaw. But wars do not care for the hopes of tired men. The change did not arrive with the blare of sirens or the shouting of orders. It began, instead, in the shadowed interior of a command tent, where a single telegraph wire brought news from the north. The message was a whisper of desperation, a plea from a town swallowed by snow and surrounded by darkness. In that dimly lit tent, a map was gently unrolled across a wooden folding table. The paper was heavy, worn soft at the edges from months of handling. A young clerk, holding a lantern in one hand and a soft lead pencil in the other, leaned over the topography of Europe. He traced his finger along the blue lines of rivers and the brown ridges of mountains, moving away from the east, where they were supposed to go, and drifting upward, toward the north. He drew a new line. It was a simple, quiet gesture. Just the soft scratch of graphite against paper. But that single, curving mark carried the weight of thousands of lives. It was a map of whispers, a silent command that would ripple outward from the warm glow of the lantern into the cold, damp evening. The news traveled through the camps not as a shout, but as a murmur, passed from tent to tent, from foxhole to foxhole, like a lantern passed hand to hand in the dark. A sergeant, an older man with kind, tired eyes, walked slowly down the row of canvas shelters. He didn't yell. He didn't blow a whistle. He simply pulled back the flap of each tent, letting in a swirl of gray mist, and spoke in a low, even voice. "Pack it up, boys. We're moving." Inside his tent, Samuel stopped humming. He looked at his boots, finally clean, finally dry. He looked at his socks, still damp on the twine. He didn't complain. He didn't throw his hands up in anger. There was only a quiet, heavy sigh, the collective exhale of men who understand that their rest was only an illusion. Slowly, methodically, the camp began to dismantle itself. The fires that had been so carefully tended were extinguished, hissing softly as damp earth was kicked over the embers. The smell of wood smoke was replaced by the cold, metallic scent of the evening air. In another part of the camp, an ambulance driver named David was sitting in the driver's seat of his vehicle, writing a letter on the steering wheel. He was writing to his sister, telling her about a stray dog he had found near the cook tent, and how he hoped to keep it until the war was over. When the shadow of his commanding officer fell across the windshield, David didn't need to hear the words. He saw the look in the officer's eyes, a look of profound, apologetic sorrow. David stopped writing mid-sentence. He carefully capped his fountain pen, blew gently on the ink to dry it, and folded the paper into a neat, small square. He slipped it into his pocket, right next to a photograph of his family. He whispered a quiet goodbye to the imaginary quiet winter he had been writing about, and reached for the ignition. There is a unique kind of heartbreak in having to pack up a place where you felt safe, even for just a little while. The men folded their blankets, the ruffles stiff beneath their fingers. They packed away their letters, their photographs, their small, hoarded treasures, a tin of hard candies, a carved wooden pipe, a smooth stone from a river back home. They tucked these pieces of their souls deep inside their packs, protecting them from the elements, as they prepared to offer their bodies to the storm. As the evening deepened into night, the valleys began to thrum with a new sound. It was the low, collective rumble of thousands of engines turning over, a deep vibration that shook the raindrops from the bare branches of the trees. Headlights flickered on, one by one, cutting through the damp fog like pale, searching eyes. A mechanic, his hands permanently stained with grease and oil, stood by the side of the muddy road. He watched the massive trucks roll slowly past, their tires sinking deep into the ruts. He reached out and gently patted the cold steel fender of a passing vehicle, a silent prayer for the machine and the fragile human lives carried inside it. He knew the strain the ice and snow would put on the engines. He knew the treacherous, unlit roads that awaited them. But he also knew the men driving them. He knew their quiet resolve. The turn to the north was an impossible feat of gravity and grace. It was as if an entire ocean current had suddenly, seamlessly decided to flow backward. There was no chaos, no frantic rushing in the dark. There was only a slow, deliberate shifting of weight. Samuel hoisted his heavy pack onto his shoulders, feeling the familiar, bruising weight settle against his collarbones. He stepped out of the muddy field and onto the hardened road, joining a river of men clothed in olive wool. They walked in silence, their heads bowed against the chilling wind. The only sounds were the rhythmic, hypnotic crunch of boots on the gravel, the squeak of leather harnesses, and the gentle clinking of metal canteens. No one asked why they were going. By now, the whisper had become a full story. They knew about the town surrounded by the white woods. They knew about the boys trapped in the cellars, holding the line with empty rifles and freezing hands. They didn't know the names of the men in Bastogne. They had never seen their faces. But in the quiet brotherhood of the cold, they were family. As they marched, a few men looked up toward the northern horizon. The sky there was different. It wasn't the soft, weeping gray of the French valleys. It was a bruised, heavy iron color, promising snow and bitter, biting frost. It looked like a wall of solid winter. Yet, they walked toward it. They walked away from the warm hearths they had imagined, away from the quiet Christmas they had promised themselves in their letters. They walked with their private fears tucked safely behind their ribs, carrying the weight of the world in their canvas packs. The map had been redrawn, a simple pencil line redirecting thousands of destinies. And as the long, dark column of men and machines disappeared into the misty northern night, leaving behind nothing but empty fields and the fading scent of wood smoke, they became the answer to a prayer whispered in the snow. They were the lifeline, stretching out through the dark, moving quietly and steadily toward the closing ring, carrying with them the fragile, invincible warmth of hope. To move a mountain in the dark, you do not push, you simply ask the heavy stones to walk. When an entire army decides to change its course, it does not happen with the crisp, effortless turn of a compass needle. It is a slow, groaning, colossal thing. It is a surreal ballet of iron and exhaust, played out on narrow, freezing roads that were never meant to carry the weight of the world. It is a river of tired men and massive machines, shifting its current in the dead of night, leaving behind the muddy fields of rest to flow steadily toward the bitter snow. Imagine the inside of a heavy supply truck. The cabin is a cramped, freezing box of dark metal and rough canvas. The air smells of diesel fumes, damp wool, and the metallic tang of cold steel. Behind the massive, rigid circle of the steering wheel sits a young man named Elias. Elias is far from the wide, golden plains of his youth, where the roads were straight and the horizon stretched out forever beneath a friendly sun. Here, the world has shrunk to the few feet of icy pavement he can see through a frosted windshield. He is driving in the blackout. There are no headlights to pierce the gloom, no street lamps to guide the way. There are only the tiny, hooded slivers of red light, called cat's eyes, on the back of the truck creeping along immediately in front of him. Elias must follow those two tiny red dots into the abyss, trusting that the unseen driver ahead knows the way, just as the unseen driver behind him trusts in his taillights. It is a fragile, unbroken chain of faith, stretching for miles through the frozen dark. The steering wheel is a block of ice beneath his thick, stiff gloves. Every turn of the road requires a heavy, full-body pull, his shoulders aching with the effort of keeping the massive, lumbering giant on the narrow pavement. The engine roars with a deep, hypnotic rhythm, a steady vibration that travels up through the floorboards, into the soles of his boots, and settles deep in his weary bones. It would be so easy to close his eyes. The hum of the engine is a lullaby, the swaying of the cab a gentle cradle. The sheer, overwhelming exhaustion of the past few months pulls at his eyelids like soft, heavy weights. To stay awake, Elias plays a quiet game with his memories. He carefully unspools them, one by one, like precious silk thread in the dark. He thinks of his mother's kitchen on a Tuesday morning, the air thick with the smell of rising dough and roasted coffee. He thinks of the old hound dog asleep by the stove, its paws twitching in some unseen dream. He thinks of his father's hands, rough from the fields but incredibly gentle when they held a bruised sparrow. Tucked into his left breast pocket, right over his beating heart, is a folded letter from his younger sister. He cannot read it in the dark, but he knows the words by heart. She wrote about the county fair, about the blue ribbon she won for her blackberry preserves, and how they were saving a jar for him in the cellar. He touches the outside of his pocket, feeling the crinkled paper through his heavy coat. That small square of paper is his anchor. It tethers him to the earth, keeping him from drifting away into the hypnotic, snowy void. Beside him, slouched against the freezing passenger door, his co-driver, Leo, is asleep. Leo is barely 19, a quiet boy with a smudge of engine grease permanently settled across his cheek. He sleeps with his chin tucked into his collar, his breath coming in soft, even puffs of white mist. Elias glances over at him, feeling a sudden, quiet surge of protective warmth. They are not brothers by blood, but in the small, freezing cab of this lumbering giant, they are bound closer than family. Elias reaches over and gently adjusts the woolen blanket that has slipped from Leo's shoulders, tucking it back around the boy against the terrible draft. The simple movement is a profound act of grace in a world made of rigid iron and unforgiving ice. Outside, the great, silent ballet continues. The army is turning. Thousands of vehicles, jeeps, ambulances, massive artillery tractors, and endless lines of supply trucks are moving in a synchronized, blind procession. They weave through sleeping French villages where the stone houses sit with closed shutters, entirely dark. Occasionally, a shape will emerge from the freezing fog at a crossroads. A lone military policeman, standing in the bitter wind, waving a dimly lit baton to guide the giants through a treacherous turn. Elias watches these solitary figures as he rolls past. Their faces are hidden beneath heavy helmets and thick scarves, but Elias always offers a small, slow nod. The figures nod back. It is a silent, fleeting communion between strangers, a shared acknowledgement of the cold, the dark, and the tremendous burden they are carrying together. As the hours crawl by, the air begins to change. The damp chill of the lower valleys slowly sharpens into something harder, something that bites at the skin and freezes the breath. The rain that had been softly pattering against the canvas roof turns to a dry, hissing sleet, and then, finally, to snow. The flakes are huge and heavy. They swirl out of the blackness, rushing toward the windshield like a storm of white stars. The heavy wiper blades groan in protest as they drag across the glass, smearing the ice into a translucent film. Elias leans forward, his chest almost touching the steering wheel, his eyes straining to keep focus on the two red dots ahead. He knows where they are going. No one had to tell him. The whisper had traveled down the line before they even started their engines. They are going north. They are going toward the trapped town. In the back of his massive truck, beneath the heavy canvas tarp, are crates of woolen blankets, tins of preserved meat, and small, fragile glass vials of medicine wrapped carefully in straw. To a general looking at a map, Elias is just a microscopic speck of logistics, a tiny gear in a massive machine. But to Elias, and to the thousands of drivers just like him, the cargo they carry is sacred. They are not just hauling supplies. They are hauling survival. They are hauling tomorrow. Leo stirs in the passenger seat, taking a sharp, shivering breath. He opens his eyes, blinking away the confusion of sleep, and looks out at the hypnotic swirl of the snow. Where are we? Leo whispers, his voice thick with fatigue. Elias keeps his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the freezing wheel. Just keeping the wheels turning, Leo, he says softly. Just moving up the road. Leo nods, pulling his stiff hands from his pockets and rubbing them together. He reaches down and unscrews the cap of their battered thermos. The coffee inside is lukewarm and tastes entirely of tin and bitterness, but as he hands the cup to Elias, it feels like an offering of pure gold. Elias takes a slow sip, letting the weak warmth wash down his throat. Thanks, kid, he murmurs. They do not talk about the snow. They do not talk about the invisible enemy waiting in the woods ahead, or the fact that they have been driving for 14 hours without rest. Instead, they talk about small things. Leo talks about a girl he met at a dance before he shipped out, how she wore a yellow ribbon in her hair and laughed at all his terrible jokes. Elias listens, letting the boy's soft voice fill the cramped, cold space, pushing back the absolute silence of the winter night. As they speak, the darkest part of the night begins to gently peel away. It is not a bright, triumphant sunrise. It is a slow, gray thinning of the blackness. The shadows of the trees at the edge of the road begin to take shape. And as the pale, bruised light of dawn finally seeps over the frozen hills, the true, awe-inspiring scale of the movement is revealed. Elias looks in his side mirror. Stretching out behind him, as far as the eye can see, is a winding, endless ribbon of olive drab and iron. Hundreds of trucks, nose to tail, dusted with a thick layer of white snow, crawling steadily over the treacherous, icy hills. And ahead of him, the line continues, disappearing into the white mist of the northern horizon. It is a breathtaking sight. An entire army, pulled from its slumber, turning its massive weight against the wind, marching into the teeth of the storm. Elias feels a sudden, quiet tightening in his chest. It is not fear. It is awe. He is part of this massive, living, breathing creature. He feels the weight of the giant in his hands, the power of thousands of engines humming the same low, resonant note. The snow is falling harder now, covering the road, burying the fields. The journey is far from over, and the hardest miles are yet to come. But as Elias grips the wheel, shifting his tired shoulders and pressing his heavy boot down on the pedal, he finds a strange, deep peace. He thinks of the boys trapped in the cellars of the town ahead. He imagines them looking up at the gray sky, waiting for a miracle. And as the great engines roar against the winter wind, turning the giants slowly but surely toward the snow, Elias whispers a quiet promise into the frozen glass. We are coming. Just hold on a little longer in the dark. We are coming. There is a profound and heavy sound when 1,000 wearied boots break the untouched crust of a winter's sleep. It is not a loud noise, but a rhythmic, collective crunch that settles deep into the quiet of the forest, a sound like tearing parchment, endlessly repeating under a vast, gray sky. The march had begun. The men of the Third Army, pulled so suddenly from their illusions of a quiet winter rest, now found themselves stepping out from the muddy fields and the damp, sheltering barns, turning their faces toward the bitter north. They were leaving behind the faint scent of wood smoke and the small, carefully guarded warmth of their temporary homes, stepping out onto roads that had been swallowed entirely by the white unknown. If you were to stand quietly by the side of that frozen road, beneath the drooping branches of the ancient pines, you would not see a parade of conquerors. You would see a river of shivering boys, their olive-drab coats dusted with fresh snowfall, their heads bowed beneath the weight of heavy canvas packs and the relentless, driving wind. They walked in two long, staggered columns, one on each side of the narrow, icy lane, leaving the center open for the slow, groaning passage of the supply trucks and the medical jeeps. But mostly, it was just the men, placing one frozen foot in front of the other. The air was so cold it felt brittle, as if the sky itself might shatter if a man were to shout. But no one shouted. The men had long since stopped talking, conserving their breath, hoarding whatever fragile heat their bodies could generate. Their breath plumed into the freezing air, creating a soft, shifting fog that hovered just above the column, a collective ghost of their exertion. The moisture from their exhales drifted up to the rims of their heavy steel helmets and settled on the rough wool of their scarves, freezing into delicate, tiny crystals of ice that framed their young, exhausted faces. In the middle of this silent, moving river walked a young rifleman named William. William was a quiet boy from a town where the snow never fell, a place of warm rains and endless green summers. The cold here was a living thing to him, an alien presence that gnawed at his fingers and seeped through the thick rubber soles of his overshoes. His rifle, slung heavily over his right shoulder, felt like a solid block of ice, the canvas strap biting into his collarbone through layers of damp wool. William did not look at the horizon. The horizon was a terrifying, endless expanse of white. Instead, he shrank his world down to the most manageable size possible. His entire universe became the back of the coat worn by the man walking directly in front of him. The man ahead was a corporal named Arthur. Arthur's coat was frayed at the hem, and his canvas pack swayed with a steady, hypnotic rhythm, left, right, left, right. Hanging from the bottom of Arthur's pack was a small, metal entrenching tool. It clinked softly against the canteen with every step. Clink. Crunch. Clink. Crunch. William anchored his mind to that gentle, metallic sound. It became a metronome for his own survival. When Arthur's left foot broke the snow, William's left foot followed. When Arthur shifted his shoulders to bear the weight of his pack, William did the same. It was a silent, unwritten pact between them. As long as Arthur kept walking, William would keep walking. As long as that shovel gently tapped against that canteen, the world had not completely stopped turning. This was the quiet magic of the march. The men were entirely isolated in their own private cocoons of cold, trapped with their own shivering thoughts, and yet they were profoundly connected. They were a single, breathing organism, bound together by the narrow path they were carving through the frost. Sometimes, the column would come to a sudden, unexplained halt. The men would stop, their momentum broken, and simply stand in the drifting snow. They did not sit down. They knew that if they sat on the frozen earth, their tired muscles might never find the strength to stand up again. Instead, they leaned heavily on the barrels of their rifles, letting the heavy wooden stocks take a fraction of their weight. During one of these quiet pauses, Arthur turned around to look at William. Arthur's face was drawn, his lips pale, but his eyes were remarkably kind. He saw the violent, uncontrollable shiver racking William's thin frame. Arthur didn't offer hollow words of encouragement. The cold was too vast for words. Instead, he slowly reached his thick, clumsy glove into the deep pocket of his coat. He pulled out a single, battered piece of hard peppermint candy. It was wrapped in clear cellophane that had become cloudy with age and pocket lint. With painstaking slowness, his numb fingers working carefully, Arthur peeled the wrapper away. He broke the small candy exactly in half, the sharp snap sounding loud in the quiet forest. He held out his palm, offering a piece to William. William took it, slipping it past his cracked lips. The sharp, sweet fire of the peppermint bloomed in his mouth, an explosion of flavor in a world that had become entirely numb and gray. For a fleeting moment, the sweet taste brought a rush of memories: Christmas mornings in a warm parlor, the smell of pine needles indoors, the laughter of a younger sister. It was only a tiny sliver of candy, but in the depths of the Ardennes, it felt like a magnificent feast. William looked up at Arthur and gave a small, barely perceptible nod. Arthur nodded back, and then turned to face the north again, just as the column began to slowly, painfully move forward once more. Further back in the line, a medic named Samuel walked with a heavy medical bag bumping softly against his hip. Samuel was an older man, a father of two, and he watched the young boys marching with a quiet, breaking heart. His eyes did not scan the trees for danger, his eyes were glued to the men's feet. He watched the way they stepped, looking for the telltale drag of a numb limb, the subtle, agonizing limp that meant the frost was settling into the toes. He knew the terrible, silent damage the wet wool and the freezing snow could do. When a boy would stumble, his foot catching on a hidden rut of ice beneath the powder, Samuel would be there in an instant, his hand reaching out to steady a frozen shoulder. "Easy now, son," Samuel would whisper, his voice a low, soothing hum over the crunching snow. "Just keep the blood moving. Don't let it settle. You're doing fine. Just fine." Samuel was tired, too. His own boots were soaked, his own back ached, but he carried the emotional weight of 100 men. He was the quiet guardian of the march, offering a steadying hand, a whispered reassurance, a reminder that someone was watching over them in the white wilderness. As the hours drifted by, the gentle beauty of the snow began to assert itself over the hardship. If you could somehow forget the aching muscles and the biting wind, the forest was a place of breathtaking, surreal majesty. The ancient pine trees towered on either side of the road, their massive branches bowed low under thick, heavy blankets of pure white. The snow fell in large, lazy flakes, drifting down like feathers from some enormous, unseen bird. It coated the helmets of the marching men, turning them into a moving procession of pale statues. The world was muffled, softened, stripped of all its sharp edges and harsh colors. Everything was rendered in shades of silver, gray, and blinding white. It was a landscape from a fairy tale, a sleeping kingdom waiting to be awakened. But the men walking through it knew that this beauty was deceptive. The snow was a soft, silent blanket that could easily become a shroud. As the afternoon wore on, the sky began to deepen. The flat gray canvas above them bruised into a deep, velvety indigo, signaling the approach of twilight. The temperature, already bitterly cold, began to drop even further, a physical weight pressing down on the marching column. With the gathering dark came the wandering of the mind. When the eyes can no longer see the horizon, the heart turns inward. A soldier named Thomas, walking near the front of the column, let his mind drift away from the rhythm of his boots. He thought of his wife, Eleanor, back in a small apartment in a busy city. He imagined her standing by the stove, pouring a cup of hot tea, the windows steamy against the city winter. He had started a letter to her 2 nights ago, sitting on his cot in the resting camp, but he had been too tired to finish it. Now, the half-written page sat folded in his breast pocket, pressed tightly against his chest. In his mind, he finished the letter. He didn't tell her about the cold, or the heavy pack, or the terrifying silence of the woods. He whispered the words in his head as he walked. "I am walking through a forest made of glass, Eleanor. It is so quiet here, I can hear my own heart beating. And with every beat, I am thinking of you. The snow is falling, but I am keeping warm by remembering the way you smile when you read a good book." It was these quiet, invisible letters, written in the minds of thousands of men, that kept the column moving. They were walking away from safety, yes, but they were also carrying their loved ones with them, holding those precious memories like small, sheltered flames against the wind. They also knew, in the quiet depths of their hearts, why they were marching. The whisper had traveled down the line, passed from mouth to frosted ear. They were walking toward Bastogne. To most of them, it was just a strange name on a map they had never seen, a small gathering of stone houses in a foreign forest. But the name had come to mean something entirely different. It meant that other boys wearing the same olive wool, were surrounded in the dark. It meant that brothers were waiting, hungry and cold, hoping for a miracle. And so, the Third Army became that miracle. Not with a sudden, glorious charge, but with the slow, agonizing, beautiful persistence of putting one foot in front of the other. The night finally fell, absolute and complete. The forest vanished into total darkness, leaving only the sound of the wind and the endless, hypnotic crunch of boots on the icy road. They walked by faith, following the shadow of the man in front of them, trusting the line, trusting the medic watching their steps, trusting the memories tucked over their hearts. They were a river of shadows flowing through the frost. And long after the column had passed, long after the last exhausted boy had disappeared into the winter night, their footsteps remained. Deeply pressed into the pristine snow, a long, winding ribbon of resilience, a path carved entirely by quiet courage, leading through the dark and straight toward the dawn. There is a fragile magic in a blank piece of paper, a quiet promise that even in the deepest winter, a voice can travel across the dark. In the deepest, most silent hours of the night, the long march of the rescue column came to a temporary, exhausted halt. The men were told to rest, just for a little while, before the sky began to turn the pale, bruised color of morning. They did not pitch tents. They did not build fires. They simply sank into the snowbanks along the edge of the invisible road, pulling their heavy woolen collars high over their ears and tucking their frozen hands beneath their arms. The forest around them was a cathedral of ice and shadow, vast and indifferent to the shivering boys huddled beneath its ancient, drooping branches. But even in this profound, paralyzing cold, the human heart seeks a place to land. When the body is trapped in a frozen wilderness, the mind builds a bridge to anywhere else. All along the snow-covered ditches and in the hollows beneath the pine trees, a quiet rustling began. It was the soft, delicate sound of stiff fingers reaching deep into the inner pockets of heavy canvas coats. They were searching for treasures far more valuable than rations or warmth. They were searching for thin, crinkled squares of paper. They were searching for stumps of soft lead pencils, worn down to the wood, and small, precious matchbooks kept dry in layers of oilcloth. Imagine a young boy named Henry, sitting with his back pressed against the rough, frozen bark of an oak tree. The cold of the wood seeped straight through his coat, but he barely felt it. His attention was entirely focused on a small piece of pale blue paper resting on his knee. His hands were numb, the joints stiff and uncooperative. He had to wedge the tiny pencil stub between his first and second fingers, holding it clumsily, like a child learning to write for the very first time. He leaned his head down, bringing his face close to his knees to shield his work from the biting wind. Beside him, his friend John, an older boy from the same county back home, shifted closer. Without a word, John unbuttoned the front of his own coat and held the heavy canvas open, creating a small, windless sanctuary around Henry's hands. Then, John struck a single match. The flame flared to life, a tiny, brilliant speck of orange and gold in a world entirely consumed by black and white. It illuminated the boys' faces, their cheeks smudged with dirt and frost, their eyes heavy with an impossible fatigue. But in the warm, flickering light of that single match, there was a profound, quiet beauty. Henry began to write. He was writing to his mother. He did not tell her that he was sitting in a snowdrift in a foreign forest, listening to the wind howl through the dark. He did not tell her about the ache in his frozen feet or the terrifying, silent journey that lay ahead. He knew she would worry, and he loved her too much to send his fear across the ocean. Instead, he lied with a gentle, breaking grace. He wrote that the stars in the winter sky here were beautiful, brighter than he had ever seen. He wrote that he was keeping warm, that he had a thick pair of socks, and that the food was not so bad. But mostly, he wrote about her. He asked if she had planted the winter bulbs by the front steps yet. He told her he could almost smell the cinnamon and apples she baked on Sunday mornings. He pressed his pencil into the paper, trying to push all of his love, all of his longing, into the soft graphite loops and lines. He was weaving his heart into the snow, trying to capture a sliver of her warm kitchen to carry with him into the dawn. When the match burned down to John's thick fingertips, he blew it out gently and struck another. He would burn through his entire precious supply just to give his friend the light to write his way home. This was the quiet, everyday heroism of the freezing woods. A few yards away, in the shelter of a ruined, stone farming wall, a man named Arthur sat alone. He was older than the rest, a quiet man with a gentle smile and a wife waiting in a small apartment halfway across the world. He did not have a match. He was writing by the faint, ghostly luminescence of the snow itself, letting his eyes adjust to the deep shadows. Arthur was writing to his young daughter. She was only 4, too young to understand the grand, terrible machinery of the world. So, Arthur wrote her a fairy tale. He described the Ardennes forest not as a place of struggle, but as a magical, sleeping kingdom draped in sugar-white frost. He told her about the trees that looked like giant, sleepy men wearing heavy white coats, and how the wind sounded like a choir humming a lullaby to the earth. He wrote that he was on a great adventure, walking through the snow to help some friends who were lost in the dark. As he wrote, a single, heavy snowflake drifted down from the canopy above and landed squarely on his paper. It rested there for a moment, a perfect, intricate star of ice, before melting into a tiny, damp circle over the blue ink of his daughter's name. Arthur stared at that small watermark. He slowly reached up and brushed a freezing tear from his own cheek. He carefully folded the letter, making sure the edges met perfectly, and sealed it. He didn't know if a mail truck would ever find them out here. He didn't know if this piece of paper would ever make it across the ocean to rest in her small, warm hands. But the act of writing it was a tether. It anchored his soul to the light, keeping him from being swallowed entirely by the dark. All through the resting column, these tiny, hidden moments unfolded. Hundreds of men, wrapped in the absolute freeze of the winter night, writing words of profound tenderness. They wrote to sweethearts they had only known for a few summer weeks, promising a lifetime of springtimes they weren't sure they would ever see. They wrote to fathers, expressing a quiet, unspoken respect, hoping they were making them proud. They wrote to brothers, sharing inside jokes and memories of childhood mischief, trying to summon a smile to frozen lips. The silence of the forest was absolute, but the air was thick with the invisible weight of these conversations. If you could somehow see the love pouring from those tiny stubs of pencil, the dark woods would have been illuminated by 1,000 brilliant, golden threads, reaching up through the pine branches and stretching across the sky, connecting these shivering boys to the warm, beating hearts they had left behind. Sometimes, a pencil lead would snap, the soft graphite brittle from the deep freeze. There would be a quiet, frustrated sigh in the dark. But always, a moment later, a hand would reach out from a neighboring snowbank. A buddy would silently offer his own pen, or a borrowed pencil, a wordless gesture of profound understanding. There was an unspoken agreement among them: no one's letter goes unfinished. No voice is left unheard. In the dimness, a young medic named Thomas was not writing a letter of his own. He was kneeling in the snow beside a boy who was too weak, too violently shaking with the chill, to hold the pen himself. The boy, wrapped in every spare blanket Thomas could find, whispered the words into the freezing air, and Thomas, with patient, steady hands, wrote them down. Tell her I kept the silver locket she gave me," the boy whispered, his teeth chattering softly. "Tell her I look at it every night." "I will," Thomas murmured softly, his pencil scratching across the page in the dark. "I've got it down." "What else?" "Tell her not to worry about me. Tell her I'm with good men." Thomas paused for a fraction of a second, his heart aching with a heavy, sweet sorrow. He swallowed hard, keeping his voice perfectly calm, entirely soothing. "I have it. She'll be so happy to read this." You just rest now. Let me do the writing." As the hours slipped away, the overwhelming darkness of the sky slowly began to yield. It did not become bright, but the blackness diluted into a profound, heavy gray. The silhouettes of the massive pine trees began to stand out against the snowy hills. The brief, precious window of rest was coming to an end. The men knew it before the sergeants even began to walk the line. They could feel the shift in the air, the subtle tightening of the invisible thread that pulled them forward. Quickly, carefully, they finished their final sentences. They signed their names with stiff, clumsy loops. They folded the crinkled, tear-stained, snow-dampened pages into tiny, thick squares. They did not put these letters into their outer packs, where they might be lost to the snow or the mud. They unbuttoned their heavy coats, reaching past the layers of wool, and tucked the folded papers into the breast pockets of their uniform shirts, resting them directly over their hearts. It was a physical comfort. The paper itself offered no real heat, yet as they buttoned their coats back up against the wind, they felt a profound, undeniable warmth spreading through their chests. They were no longer just carrying rifles and ammunition. They were carrying the love of their mothers, the gentle smiles of their wives, the laughter of their children, and the peaceful memories of home. The soft, whispered command to move out drifted down the line, floating over the snow like a gentle breeze. "On your feet, boys. Time to go." Slowly, the men rose from the snowbanks. Their joints popped, their muscles screamed in silent protest, and the biting wind immediately lashed at their faces. But as they stepped back onto the icy road, falling into that rhythmic, swaying march toward the besieged town, they walked with a slightly different posture. They were surrounded by an ocean of white, marching into a terrifying, frozen unknown, but they were not empty. They were filled with the quiet, invincible light of the words they had just written. The tiny fires of the matches had long since gone out, leaving only the smell of sulfur and pine in the winter air. But the true warmth, the enduring, glowing embers of human connection, was tucked safely behind their ribs. And so, the column moved forward into the dawn, carrying their letters woven in snow, leaving a trail of quiet footprints in the frost, bound together by the secret, beautiful words resting gently against their beating hearts. The gentlest things, when gathered together, can become the heaviest burdens in the world. If you catch a single snowflake on the dark wool of your mitten, it weighs absolutely nothing. It is a fragile, perfect star of ice, vanishing into a tiny drop of water with the mere warmth of your breath. But when the sky opens, and those silent stars fall by the millions, by the billions, hour after hour through the long winter night, they cease to be fragile. They become a vast, suffocating ocean of white. They become a wall. They become an enemy that does not carry a rifle, but simply buries the world in a quiet, breathless hold. The road to the surrounded town of Bastogne was supposed to be a lifeline. It was a narrow ribbon of pavement winding through the ancient, rolling hills of the Ardennes, meant to carry the heavy trucks filled with medicine, food, and the weary men coming to the rescue. But the sky had other plans. The clouds hung low and heavy, the color of bruised iron, dropping a relentless curtain of snow that erased the road entirely. The great column of rescue vehicles ground to a slow, agonizing halt. The mighty engines, capable of pulling tons of steel across continents, were suddenly rendered helpless by the soft, shifting powder. Tires spun uselessly, whining against the slick ice hidden beneath the drifts. The heavy canvas-covered trucks slid toward the deep ditches, their frames groaning in the dark. The lifeline was freezing shut. In the glow of a single, shrouded headlight, a young man named Matthew leaned heavily on the wooden handle of a snow shovel. He was an engineer, though that title felt entirely too grand for the task at hand. Tonight, he was just a boy with an aching back, fighting a mountain with a piece of tin. Matthew took a slow, deep breath. The air was so cold it burned his lungs, tasting of diesel exhaust and crushed pine needles. His face was wrapped in a woolen scarf that had frozen stiff from his own breath, creating a crust of ice against his cheeks. He tightened his grip on the splintered wood of the shovel, pushed it into the heavy, wet snow, and lifted. It was a motion he had repeated 1,000 times since the sun had gone down. Push. Lift. Throw. Step forward. His shoulders burned with a deep, consuming fire. His heavy canvas coat, meant to keep the winter out, was soaked through with the sweat of his own labor, turning into a freezing shell against his skin. Beside him, in the dark, stretched a thin, exhausted line of other men just like him. There were a shadow crew of shovelers, pickaxe wielders, and boys spreading gritty ash and sand over the ice, trying to carve a path through the wilderness. There was no glory in this work. There were no medals given for moving frozen water from one side of a dirt road to the other. There was only the quiet, desperate rhythm of survival. As Matthew lifted another heavy shovel full of snow, tossing it over the high white bank that now towered above his waist, his mind drifted away from the cold. It was the only way to endure the pain. He let his thoughts travel back across the ocean, to a driveway in a quiet, suburban neighborhood. He remembered being 12 years old, bundled in an oversized coat, his mother watching from the kitchen window with a mug of hot cocoa waiting on the counter. Shoveling snow back then was a game. It was a chore that ended in warmth, laughter, and the satisfying scrape of metal on clear concrete. He remembered the quiet, muffled peace of his neighborhood, the way the street lamps cast golden circles on the fresh drifts. Here, in the deep forest, the snow was not a game. It was a barrier between life and death. Matthew knew that just a few miles up this invisible road, other boys were sitting in freezing cellars, looking at the ceiling, waiting for the sound of friendly engines. Every scoop of snow he threw into the dark was a fraction of an inch closer to those boys. "Pace yourself, kid." The voice was a low, rough whisper that drifted through the falling snow. It belonged to an older engineer named Thomas, working just a few feet away. Thomas was a giant of a man, a former steelworker with hands like leather and a quiet, steady demeanor that made everyone around him feel just a little bit safer. Matthew stopped, leaning his chin on the top of his shovel handle, his chest heaving. "It keeps filling back in," Matthew murmured, his voice trembling slightly from the cold and the exhaustion. "As soon as we clear a yard, the wind just pushes it all back. It's like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup." Thomas stopped shoveling. He didn't offer a hollow promise that it would get easier. He simply stepped closer, closing the distance between them. The snow swirled wildly in the space between their heavy coats. Thomas reached into his deep pocket and pulled out a battered metal canteen. He unscrewed the cap and offered it to Matthew. "Drink," Thomas said softly. Matthew took the canteen with clumsy, numb gloves. The water inside was freezing cold, metallic and harsh, but it moistened his cracked lips and cleared the dust of the road from his throat. He handed it back, nodding his silent thanks. "You're looking at the whole sky, Matthew," Thomas said, his voice a gentle, grounding rumble. "You can't shovel the whole sky. You can't clear the whole forest. Just look at the space right in front of your boots. Just clear that one spot. And when you step forward, clear the next one. Don't worry about the wind. The wind is just noise. We just keep moving the earth, one scoop at a time." It was a small, simple truth, but in the overwhelming white of the night, it was a lifeline. Matthew looked down at his frozen boots. He looked at the foot of unbroken snow immediately in front of him. He nodded slowly, pulling his scarf up a little higher over his nose. He plunged the shovel back into the drift. Push. Lift. Throw. The quiet heroism of the night was woven from these tiny threads of endurance. Further down the line, a heavy supply truck had slid sideways, its rear wheels completely buried in a deep, treacherous drift. The driver, a young boy with terrified eyes, was gunning the engine, the tires spinning a high, frantic whine that echoed through the trees. 3 engineers, so tired they could barely walk straight, dropped their shovels and waded into the waist-deep snow behind the truck. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They pressed their heavy, woolen shoulders against the freezing, mud-splattered metal of the tailgate. On three, one of them whispered, his breath a white cloud in the dark. 1, 2, 3. They pushed. They drove their frozen boots into the slick ice, their muscles straining to the point of tearing, their hearts hammering against their ribs. The truck groaned. The tires caught a tiny patch of sand that another soldier had hastily thrown beneath the tread. With a slow, reluctant lurch, the massive machine shifted forward, crawling out of the drift and back onto the fragile, cleared center of the road. The driver leaned out of his window, his face pale in the dim light. He didn't have words. He simply raised a trembling hand to the men standing in the snow. The engineers nodded back, panting, rubbing their bruised shoulders, before turning back to pick up their shovels. There was no time to celebrate. The snow was already falling into the deep tire tracks they had just freed. As the hours stretched into the deepest, darkest part of the night, the sheer weight of the white began to alter the landscape of their minds. The constant, hypnotic falling of the flakes, illuminated only by the faint, hooded lights of the waiting trucks, created a feeling of being entirely unmoored from the earth. The men felt as though they were floating in a silent, freezing void, where time had stopped and the only reality was the ache in their hands and the cold in their bones. To fight the numbness, they shared quiet stories over the scrape of the shovels. They didn't talk about the war. They talked about the warmth. A boy named Leo talked about his grandfather's greenhouse, describing the heavy, humid air filled with the scent of damp soil and blooming orchids. He described how the glass panes would steam up on the inside while the winter raged outside. The men listened, letting the imagined warmth of that glass house settle over their shivering shoulders. Another soldier hummed a gentle tune, a lullaby his wife used to sing to their infant daughter. The melody was barely audible over the wind, a fragile, beautiful note that drifted through the pines. It was a reminder that they were still human, that they still had souls that could sing, even when their bodies were breaking. Every cleared inch of that road was paid for with a memory, a shared story, a quiet act of brotherhood. When one man faltered, dropping to his knees in the snow, too exhausted to stand, two others would be there to pull him up by his coat collar, brushing the snow from his shoulders, taking his shovel for a while until he could catch his breath. They were a family forged in ice. Sometime just before dawn, the wind finally began to settle. The heavy, angry swirling of the storm softened into a gentle, vertical snowfall. The sky above the pine canopy turned from black to a deep, bruised charcoal, then slowly to a pale, misty gray. Matthew stood at the edge of the road, leaning heavily against his shovel. His hands were curled into permanent, frozen claws inside his mittens. His coat was a solid shell of ice. But as he looked back down the winding path they had carved through the night, a profound, quiet peace washed over him. The road was narrow. It was treacherous, lined with towering walls of pure white snow. But it was open. Behind him, the low, deep rumble of a heavy engine shifted gears. A supply truck, its hood piled high with snow, began to slowly, carefully inch forward. The heavy chains on its tires bit into the hard-packed, shoveled earth with a rhythmic, reassuring crunch. Matthew stepped back into the deep snowbank to let the giant pass. The driver, his face framed by the frosted window, looked down at the young engineer. The driver slowly reached up and tapped two fingers over his heart. A silent, immense thank you. As the truck rolled by, followed by another, and then another, moving steadily toward the trapped men in Bastogne, Matthew didn't feel the cold anymore. He watched the lifeline breathe again. He watched the slow, mechanical heartbeat of the rescue push through the path he had dug with his own freezing hands. Thomas stepped up beside him, his massive shoulders covered in a fresh layer of white. He looked at the passing trucks, then looked at Matthew. "We moved the earth, kid," Thomas whispered gently. "We moved the earth," Matthew softly replied. They stood together in the quiet dawn, the weight of the white still falling gently around them, watching the trucks carry their hope down the road. They were just tired boys leaning on wooden shovels, but in the heart of the freezing forest, they had held the winter back. They had kept the door open. And in the soft, morning light, that was the most beautiful thing in the world. The horizon no longer promised a sunrise, but instead, it offered the soft, bruised sigh of something burning deep within the white. For days, the march had been a journey through a world of absolute, pristine purity, a kingdom of snow, pine, and silence. But as the long, snaking column of the relief force pushed further into the northern forests, the character of the winter began to change. The air, which had been crisp and clean, now carried a strange, heavy scent, an acrid, clinging whisper of wood smoke, wet earth, and the sharp, metallic tang of iron. It was the scent of a world beginning to unravel. A young man named Elias, walking near the front of the column, was the first to notice the shift. He stopped for a moment, his boots sinking into the deep, drifted crust, and narrowed his eyes against the stinging, gray mist. There, rising above the dark silhouettes of the pine trees, was a thin, crooked finger of black smoke. It drifted lazily into the leaden sky, a stark, lonely smudge on a canvas of white. Elias didn't speak. He simply stood there, a quiet, olive-clad figure in a frozen wilderness, watching the smoke. He felt a sudden, cold tightening in his chest, not the biting cold of the wind, but a different kind of frost, one that settled deep behind his ribs. He realized, with a slow, sinking clarity, that they were no longer walking through a fairy tale. The magic was gone. They were approaching the edge of the struggle. Behind him, the rest of the column slowed. The hypnotic crunch of thousands of boots against the snow grew hesitant, then stopped. A silence fell over the forest, a silence so profound it felt like the woods themselves were holding their breath. The men didn't whisper. They didn't ask questions. They simply looked toward the horizon, their faces framed by heavy scarves and frost-rimmed helmets, their eyes reflecting the distant, smoldering gray. They were seeing the outskirts of a village that, only a few days ago, had been a place of quiet hearths and evening prayers. Now, it was a ghost of itself. Through the shifting veil of the morning fog, the village revealed itself in fragments, a jagged, toothless wall of stone, a shattered roof silhouetted against the gray, and the dark, hollow eyes of windows that had once looked out upon peaceful summer gardens. In the center of the village square, a small, overturned wagon lay buried in the snow, its wooden wheels pointing toward the sky like the broken limbs of a fallen bird. There was no movement. There was no sound of children playing, no clatter of farm carts, no calls from neighbor to neighbor. The village was a shell, a monument to a sudden, violent interruption of life. The men of the Third Army, these weary travelers from the south, felt a collective, heavy sorrow wash over them. They were not looking at a map, they were looking at the wreckage of a home. A medic named Samuel, walking beside Elias, reached out and placed a steadying hand on the boy's shoulder. Samuel's hand was thick, calloused, and felt incredibly solid in the fragile, freezing light. "Steady now," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible over the soft, distant crackle of a burning timber. "Just look at the road, Elias. Don't look at the houses. Just keep your eyes on the road." Elias nodded, though he couldn't pull his gaze away. He was thinking of his own home, of the small, white house with the green shutters where his mother was likely, at this very moment, setting the table for a breakfast he would never share. He thought of the way the sunlight hit the polished wood of the kitchen floor, a warm, golden rectangle of comfort. He imagined that light being snuffed out, replaced by the cold, biting gray of this ruined village. He imagined his mother's face, etched with the same terror he saw in the silent, empty houses before him. The reality of their task began to sink in, not as a duty on a page, but as a visceral, bone-deep understanding. They had been told they were coming to save a town, a strategy, a line on a map. Now, they saw what that meant. They were coming to save the people who had lived in these houses. They were coming to rescue the very idea of a home from the encroaching, freezing dark. As the column began to move forward again, a slow, deliberate, and cautious crawl, the men encountered the first signs of the people who had lived here. At the edge of the village, huddled in the entrance of a stone barn, a small group of villagers had found shelter. There were a cluster of blankets and coats, a tangle of human warmth against the biting chill. Among them was an old man, his face a map of deep, weathered lines, and a young woman holding a bundled infant to her chest. When the soldiers approached, the villagers did not flee. They simply watched, their eyes wide and hollow. They were exhausted, their spirits broken by the sheer, relentless intrusion of the war into their quiet, sheltered lives. A soldier named Thomas, who had been carrying a small, extra tin of rations in his pack, saw the mother and child. Without a word, he stepped out of the line. He walked over to the barn entrance, his boots crunching softly on the snow. He didn't look like a hero, he looked like a boy who had walked for 3 days in the mud and the ice. He stopped a few feet away and knelt in the snow. He reached into his coat and pulled out the tin, a simple, dented thing of canned peaches he had been saving for a day when he felt especially hungry. He didn't offer it with a flourish or a speech. He just placed it gently on the frozen ground and slid it toward the woman. The woman looked at the tin, then up at Thomas. She saw the boy beneath the helmet, the grime of the road on his chin, the profound, aching weariness in his eyes. She saw, for a moment, not a soldier, but a son. A slow, tentative smile broke through the mask of her exhaustion, a small, fragile, and beautiful thing. She nodded, her eyes filling with a sudden, sharp light, and whispered a word in a language Thomas didn't know. Thomas nodded back, stood up, and walked quietly back to the column. He didn't look for praise. He didn't tell anyone what he had done. He simply returned to his place in the line, picked up the strap of his rifle, and kept walking. But as he joined the river of men, his posture seemed a little lighter. The weight of the march, the biting cold, the uncertainty of the road ahead, it all felt a little more bearable. He had shared a moment of grace in the middle of a war, and that was enough. The column pushed deeper into the contested area, the trees becoming thicker, the shadows longer. The horizon was now a shifting, haunting landscape of smoke and mist. They were entering the woods where the unseen struggle was hidden, where the crack of a branch and the sudden, jagged flash of light meant everything had changed. The men became ghosts themselves, moving with a heightened, nervous awareness. They walked not with their heads down, as they had during the long, silent march, but with their eyes scanning the tree-line, searching for the flickers of movement that told of an enemy hidden in the white. Their private fears were now tucked away, buried deep beneath a layer of fierce, protective resolve. Every man in that line was remembering someone, a mother, a wife, a child, a brother. And every man was walking for them. They were walking for the village they had just passed, for the mother with the tin of peaches, for the infant who deserved a world without smoke. The everyday heroism was everywhere. It was in the soldier who shared his last dry socks with a boy whose feet were beginning to swell. It was in the medic who kept walking despite the deep, aching cramp in his side. It was in the truck driver who gripped the wheel with bleeding, cracked knuckles, refusing to let the machine stall in the snow. It was in the way they moved together, a massive, breathing, living organism of resilience, shifting its weight through the forest, a shield of wool and hope moving slowly toward the fire. As the light began to fade once more, the smoke from the village seemed to merge with the encroaching night. The sky became a swirl of charcoal and indigo, the trees reaching up like grasping fingers into the dark. But the men didn't stop. They didn't retreat. Elias looked at the soldier in front of him, at the steady, rhythmic sway of his pack, at the way his boots cut a clear, purposeful path through the drift. He took a breath, letting the cold air fill his lungs, letting the scent of the smoke be replaced by the quiet, earthy smell of the pine forest. He was scared. He was tired beyond measure. He was a boy who just wanted to be home. But he was here. And as he stepped forward, into the darkening woods, he felt the presence of the thousands of men walking beside him, a vast, silent, and invincible tide. The village was behind them, a memory of smoke and stone. Ahead of them lay the heart of the forest, and the town that was waiting for the light. They walked on, into the gray, into the cold, into the smoke, their footsteps a quiet, persistent promise that they would not stop until the dark was gone. The horizon was burning, but they were the fire that would save the day. They were the hope that walked through the snow, carrying the light, one slow, deliberate step at a time, moving deeper into the woods, toward the ones who were waiting, toward the ones who were listening, toward the dawn. The forest is never truly silent, it only waits for the right moment to speak in whispers of pine and shadow. As the Third Army pushed deeper into the dense, snow-laden woods of the Ardennes, the world shrank. The open roads and rolling hills of France dissolved into a labyrinth of towering spruce and silver-barked birch, their branches locked together in a tight, suffocating embrace. Here, the light was always thin and gray, filtering down through the heavy canopy like liquid mercury. The air felt compressed, held tight by the weight of the ancient trees, and every movement, the snap of a dry twig, the soft thud of snow falling from a branch, seemed to echo for miles. For the young men moving in small, cautious patrols through these deep woods, the silence was not a comfort. It was a test. It was a pressure against the eardrums, a constant, low-level vibration of unseen possibility. Imagine a soldier named Daniel. He was 20 years old, a boy who had grown up in the wide, flat wheat fields of the Midwest, where the horizon was a straight line and you could see a storm coming from 10 miles away. Here, the horizon was only 10 feet in front of his face. He walked with his rifle held at the low carry, his knuckles white against the dark wood, his breath coming in shallow, careful sips. He was not afraid of the cold anymore, he was afraid of the spaces between the trees. Daniel's world had narrowed to the small, dark patches of earth between the snowdrifts, the gnarled roots that threatened to trip his heavy boots, and the rhythmic, muffled sound of his own heart beating against his ribs. He felt watched. It was the feeling you get when you are walking home through the woods after dark, the sense that the trees are leaning in, tilting their heads to observe your passage. A few yards behind him walked Arthur, a man who had been a carpenter before the war. Arthur walked with a different kind of grace, a slow, observant tread that avoided the loudest patches of crusty snow. He noticed everything, the way a bird took flight, the slight deviation in the direction of the wind, the faint, unnatural stillness of a thicket that should have been rustling. They had been walking for hours, their bodies aching with a deep, bone-weary cold. The skirmishes here were not grand battles. They were sudden, violent ruptures in the quiet, a flash of light in the gray haze, a sharp, angry crack that echoed like a hammer on an anvil, and then, just as quickly, a return to the absolute, haunting stillness. In these moments of sudden tension, the true nature of their resilience was revealed. It wasn't found in a heroic charge, but in the small, reflexive actions of a teammate. When a sudden flash erupted from a dense patch of laurel 100 yards away, the men didn't panic. There was no screaming, no chaotic scramble. They moved like shadows. Daniel felt a hand on his shoulder, firm, steady, grounding, and he lowered himself into a snowdrift, the freezing powder instantly biting into his neck. It was Arthur. Without a word, Arthur pressed him down, his own body shielding Daniel's side. They stayed there for what felt like an hour, though it was likely only minutes, listening to the wind brush the needles overhead. In that freezing, white quiet, Daniel felt the weight of Arthur's hand on his coat. It was the most important thing in the world. It was a silent conversation. I am here. We are together. You are not alone in this dark. Their private fears, which they kept tucked away like precious stones in their pockets, were shared in those moments of stillness. They didn't speak of them, but they were visible in the way they looked at one another, the soft, empathetic glance when someone's hands wouldn't stop shaking, the gentle, reassuring pat on the back as they rose to move forward again. They were so far from home that the concept of home felt like a dream they had had a lifetime ago. A letter from a wife, a photograph of a mother, a memory of a Sunday dinner, these things felt like relics from an ancient, warmer civilization. At a quiet, frozen creek, the patrol stopped to regroup. The water was a dark, obsidian ribbon winding through the ice, the sound of its bubbling barely audible beneath the snow. Daniel knelt by the bank, his fingers numb, and broke the thin crust of ice to reach the water. He didn't drink, but he splashed his face, the freezing shock jolting his senses, grounding him in the present moment. He looked up to see a small, red-breasted bird sitting on a low branch above the creek. It was a small, defiant burst of color in the gray, monochrome world. It was preening its feathers, entirely unconcerned with the war, with the freezing temperatures, or with the men huddled in the brush. For a moment, Daniel just watched it. He felt a profound sense of awe, not at the beauty of the bird, but at its simple, undeniable life. He leaned over and whispered to Arthur, who was scanning the trees across the bank, "Look at that, Arthur. It's still here." Arthur looked up, his face softening for a fleeting second. He gave a quiet, sad smile. "Stubborn little thing, isn't it? Just keeps on living. We could take a lesson from that." It was a small moment of kindness in a world that felt devoid of mercy. That brief acknowledgement of life, that shared smile over a bird, was enough to keep them going for another mile. It was the everyday heroism of maintaining one's humanity when the environment was designed to strip it away. As they moved deeper into the pine groves, the light began to fail. The deep, purple shadows of evening stretched across the snow, and the forest began to sigh, a long, mournful sound of wind moving through the needles. The skirmishes became more frequent, tiny, sharp explosions of sound that ripped through the twilight. They fought in a blur of movement and shadow. There were no grand maneuvers, only the slow, painstaking advance from one tree to the next. The men moved in pairs, always checking on one another, always ensuring the other was still there. During one such moment, when they were pinned down behind a ridge of fallen timber, a soldier named Leo felt a hot, sharp sting in his arm. He didn't cry out. He just slumped back against the wood, his face turning the color of ash. Daniel, who had been crawling toward the same position, saw the look in Leo's eyes, the sudden, terrifying realization of his own mortality. Daniel scrambled over, ignoring the erratic crackle of fire from the ridge above. He grabbed Leo's arm, his fingers finding the warm, damp tear in the wool of the sleeve. He didn't have a bandage, so he took the scarf from his own neck, a thick, woolen thing his mother had knitted for him, and pulled it tight around the arm, his hand steady despite the adrenaline-fueled shaking of his own frame. "I've got you," Daniel said, his voice a low, fierce whisper against the din of the woods. "I've got you, Leo. You're going to be fine. Just look at me. Look at my eyes." Leo stared at him, his breathing ragged. Daniel didn't let him look away. He kept his own eyes locked on Leo's, pouring every bit of strength, every memory of his own safety, every ounce of his humanity into that gaze. He was the anchor. He was the bridge. The firing died down as quickly as it had begun, leaving only the sound of the wind. They waited there, in the dark, Daniel holding Leo's hand, the two of them huddled against the fallen pine, waiting for the cover of night so they could move back to the lines. In that hour of darkness, there were no enemies, no grand strategy, no war. There was only the sound of Leo's steadying breath, the quiet, reassuring pressure of Daniel's hand, and the ancient, swaying trees overhead. They were two boys, far from their wheat fields and their workshops, finding strength in the simple, profound act of being present for one another. They were the echoes in the pine, the quiet, enduring spirit of men who had been tested by the cold and the dark, and who had chosen, with every breath, to remain kind. As the full night finally descended, covering the woods in a blanket of absolute dark, they began to crawl back toward the main road. The snow was still falling, slow and steady, erasing their tracks as soon as they made them. The forest felt endless, a vast, sleeping creature that would soon forget they had ever been there. But they wouldn't forget. They would carry the memory of that day, the flash of the bird's breast, the touch of a hand on a shoulder, the fierce, quiet resolve of the men who stood in the gap, for the rest of their lives. They emerged from the tree line onto the main road just as the first glimmer of the moon broke through the clouds, casting a silver light over the path they had walked. They were exhausted, bruised, and forever changed by the echoes of the pine. But they were together. They had moved through the shadows, faced the sudden, violent tests of the woods, and held on to the most fragile, precious parts of themselves. The forest grew quiet again, its whispers fading into the wind. But the men kept walking, their boots crunching softly on the frozen ground, a long, winding line of resolve, moving slowly, deliberately toward the light of the town ahead, where the battle was waiting, and where the most quiet of heroics were yet to unfold. The stone beneath their backs felt like the very bones of the world, unyielding and ancient. In the small, cramped cellars beneath the town of Bastogne, time did not move in minutes or hours, but in the slow, rhythmic flicker of a dying candle and the steady, white puffs of breath that drifted into the dark. These subterranean spaces, once filled with the harvest of the summer, casks of cider, sacks of potatoes, and jars of preserved plums, had become a universe unto themselves. Above, the winter sky was a bruised and heavy gray, but down here, the world was composed of damp stone, the scent of wet wool, and a silence so deep it felt as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Imagine a young soldier named Peter. He had grown up in the sun-drenched valleys of California, where the air was scented with orange blossoms and the concept of a hard winter meant a morning with a light dew on the grass. Now, he sat on a bed of thinning straw, his back pressed against a cold, weeping wall. His fingers were tucked deep into his armpits, and his chin was buried in the rough, scratchy collar of a coat that had not been dry for a week. Peter wasn't thinking about the maps in the command post or the grand maneuvers of armies. He was thinking about the way the light hit the dust motes in his father's workshop. He was remembering the sound of a screen door slamming shut on a summer afternoon. These memories were like small, warm stones he kept in his pocket, turning them over and over in his mind to keep the chill of the cellar from reaching his soul. Beside him sat an elderly woman, Madame Gervais, whose house stood, or at least had stood, directly above them. She sat with a dignity that the cold could not touch, her hands busy with a pair of knitting needles that clicked softly in the gloom. She wasn't knitting a sweater or a scarf, she was simply moving the needles, the repetitive, familiar motion a prayer of habit. Occasionally, she would reach out and pat Peter's knee, a gesture of wordless comfort that transcended the language they didn't share. In that cellar, they were not a soldier and a civilian, they were two souls huddled against the great, white void. The air in the cellar was heavy with the weight of the unknown. Outside the thick stone walls, the world had been erased by the snow. The roads were gone. The horizon was gone. There was only the nuts of the forest, the white-on-white world where the lines of friend and foe had blurred into a terrifying, shifting mist. And then, there was the sound. It didn't arrive as a roar or a scream. It began as a vibration, a low, tectonic hum felt in the soles of their boots and the base of their spines. It was the sound of the earth being struck by a distant, heavy hand. Thud. A long silence followed, filled only by the soughing of the wind in the chimney flues above. Thud. Thud. Peter raised his head, his eyes widening in the dim light. Across the cellar, other men stirred. They were the watchers in the dark, men who had become experts in the subtle language of the wind and the snow. They listened with an intensity that made the air feel electric. Is it them? The question hung in the air, unvoiced but heavy. Is it the Third Army? Is it the relief? Or is it merely the winter claiming more of the woods? To those trapped in Bastogne, that distant artillery was more than just a sound of war. It was a rhythmic knocking at the door. It was the sound of a heartbeat, faint and far away, but still beating. Every muffled boom carried with it the possibility of a letter from home, a warm meal, a dry pair of socks, and the chance to see a spring morning. Listen, Peter whispered, though there was no one specifically to hear him. Madame Gervais stopped her needles. She tilted her head, her face etched with a lifetime of understanding what the earth sounds like when it is troubled. She closed her eyes and nodded slowly. To her, the sound was like the distant rolling of thunder before a much-needed rain. They sat there for hours, the watchers in the cellar, interpreting the silence between the thuds. They imagined the men on the other end of those guns, men like them, shivering in the frost, pushing heavy iron through the drifts, fighting for every inch of icy road. They thought of the truck drivers gripping frozen steering wheels and the engineers shoveling snow until their hands bled. They were separated by miles of treacherous forest and an ocean of white, but the sound of the guns was a bridge. In the quiet intervals, the men in the cellar shared what little they had. A single, bruised apple was sliced into 8 thin transparent pieces, passed around with a reverence usually reserved for a feast. A canteen of water, half frozen and tasting of metal, was shared like a vintage wine. These were the small sacraments of the siege. They didn't talk about the fear that sat like a lead weight in their stomachs, the fear that the thuds would stop, or that the ring would tighten until there was no room left to breathe. Instead, they talked about the first thing they would do when they got home. One man spoke of a specific bakery in a small town in Ohio, describing the smell of the cinnamon rolls so vividly that for a moment, the damp cellar air seemed to sweeten. Another spoke of a fishing hole where the water was as clear as glass and the trout were always biting. They were building a world of light and warmth with their words, a sanctuary that the winter could not invade. Peter reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled photograph. It was a picture of his dog, a scruffy terrier named Barnaby, sitting on the porch back home. The edges of the photo were worn soft from the countless times Peter had touched it in the dark. He held it out to Madame Gervais. She took it with trembling fingers, bringing it close to her eyes. She smiled, a soft, radiant thing that lit up her face. "Un bon chien," she murmured. "A good dog." Peter smiled back, a lump forming in his throat. In that moment, the distance between the Ardennes and California didn't seem quite so vast. Barnaby was waiting. The porch was waiting. The sun was waiting. The artillery grew louder for a time, a staccato rhythm that shook a fine dusting of plaster from the cellar ceiling. The dust drifted down like a second, indoor snow, settling on their helmets and blankets. Each tremor was a reminder that the world was still turning, that the struggle was moving, and that they were not forgotten. There is a specific kind of resilience that grows in the dark. It is a quiet, stubborn flame that doesn't need much fuel, just a shared look, a hand on a shoulder, or the distant sound of a friend fighting their way through the storm. The watchers in the cellar were the keepers of that flame. They were the ones who held the line of hope when the rest of the world felt like it had been swallowed by the ice. As the night wore on, the thuds began to recede, drifting back into the soft, muffled distance. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer a heavy, oppressive thing. It was a silence filled with the echo of that distant knocking. Peter leaned his head back against the stone, closing his eyes. The cold was still there, a patient guest at his side, but his heart felt a little lighter. He listened to the steady, rhythmic breathing of the others in the cellar, the soldiers, the villagers, the weary and the brave. They were all breathing together, a collective pulse beneath the snow. They would wait for the morning. They would wait for the sky to clear and for the first pale light to touch the ruins of the town. They would wait for the sound of the engines and the sight of the olive-drab trucks emerging from the mist. But for now, in the deep, velvet dark of the cellar, it was enough to know that the thuds had happened. It was enough to know that somewhere out there, in the heart of the blizzard, a great army was turning its weight toward them. It was enough to know that they were still here, breathing on the freezing glass, watching the shadows, and listening for the heartbeat of the rescue. The candle finally flickered and died, leaving them in a darkness that was absolute yet somehow gentle. In the quiet, the only sound was the soft click-click of Madame Gervais's needles, a steady, domestic heartbeat in the middle of the storm. Peter drifted into a light, shivering sleep, his hand still resting on the pocket where the photograph of Barnaby lay. He dreamed of the sun. He dreamt of the orange blossoms. And in the distance, through the layers of snow and stone and sleep, the earth continued to sigh with the weight of the coming dawn. The sky had forgotten the color of blue, until the morning the heavy curtains of gray finally parted to reveal a world bathed in an unfamiliar, golden light. For so long, the people and the soldiers within the ring of Bastogne had lived in a world of charcoal and bone. The clouds had been a low, suffocating ceiling, trapping the smoke of the ruins and the shivering breath of the weary. To look up was to see only the promise of more snow, more cold, and the endless, flat indifference of the mist. But then, as if the universe had finally taken a deep, collective breath and exhaled, the wind shifted. The fog, which had clung to the pine needles like damp wool, began to fray at the edges. It dissolved into thin, ghostly ribbons, and through the cracks in the heavens, the sun broke through. It was a quiet miracle. Men who had been huddled in the frozen earth of their foxholes for days slowly stood up, their joints creaking like the winter branches. They shielded their eyes with grimy hands, squinting against a brightness that felt almost painful after the long gloom. The snow, once a dull and threatening shroud, suddenly began to sparkle with a million tiny, blinding diamonds. For a few moments, no one spoke. There was only the sound of the wind and the sight of that vast, crystalline blue. And then, from far beyond the horizon, came a sound that didn't belong to the earth. It wasn't the sharp, angry crack of the forest skirmishes or the heavy, tectonic thud of the distant guns. It was a low, steady thrum, a vibration that lived in the chest before it reached the ears. It was the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of hundreds of engines, a drone so deep and constant it sounded like the humming of a great, celestial choir. Across the town and along the edges of the woods, the watchers waited. They looked to the south, their hearts hammering against their ribs. And there, emerging from the shimmering haze where the earth met the sky, came the birds of grace. They flew in tight, elegant formations, silver slivers against the sapphire blue, their wings catching the morning light as they moved with a slow, purposeful majesty over the white landscape. Imagine a young boy named Leo, standing in the ruins of a doorway in the center of town. He had spent the last 3 days in a dark cellar, listening to the world above him slowly shatter. Now, he watched as the bellies of those great silver planes opened. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. And then, the sky was suddenly filled with flowers. They were called parachutes, but in the eyes of the hungry and the cold, they were wings of cotton. They bloomed in an instant, great, billowing blossoms of silk in colors that seemed impossible in this monochrome world. There were shoots of brilliant crimson, deep emerald green, sunny yellow, and purest white. They drifted down with a slow, swaying elegance, caught in the gentle currents of the winter air. It was as if the spring had decided to arrive all at once, falling from the clouds in a silent, colorful rain. The descent was hushed, a beautiful contrast to the roar of the engines above. The silk canopies whispered as they caught the wind, the heavy crates beneath them swinging like pendulums. To the men below, it looked as though the heavens were finally answering 1,000 whispered prayers, sending down manna wrapped in cotton and cord. As the first crates touched down, disappearing into the deep, soft drifts of the open fields, the silence of the town broke into a flurry of quiet, determined activity. This was not the frantic energy of a battle, but the reverent haste of people receiving a gift they feared might vanish if they reached for it too quickly. A soldier named Thomas, whom we remember from the long, icy march, waded into a waist-deep drift to reach a crate draped in a green silk shroud. His hands were shaking, not just from the cold, but from a profound, overwhelming relief. He didn't use a knife, he worked at the heavy knots with his numb fingers, his breath coming in fast, white puffs. When the lid finally groaned open, he didn't find silver or gold. He found something far more precious. Inside, nestled in straw, were tins of real coffee. There were small, wax-sealed boxes of crackers and chocolate. There were packets of cigarettes that smelled of dried leaves and home. But most importantly, there were the things that keep a soul anchored to the body. In another corner of the field, a medic named Julian. The man who had spent his nights holding the hands of the feverish in the dark knelt beside a crate marked with a simple, red cross. As he pulled back the heavy canvas, he saw the neat, glass vials of penicillin and the rolls of clean, white bandages. He saw the small tins of morphine that meant an end to the screaming silence of the cellars. Julian didn't cheer. He didn't shout. He simply sat back on his heels in the snow, closed his eyes, and let a single, warm tear track through the grime on his cheek. He reached out and touched the cool glass of a vial, a silent promise to the boys waiting in the shadows that help had finally arrived. The wings of cotton brought more than just supplies, they brought the knowledge that the world had not forgotten them. When you are surrounded, when the roads are gone and the radio is silent, the greatest enemy is the feeling of being erased. You begin to wonder if the people beyond the trees still remember your name, or if you have become just another shadow in the Ardennes. But as the colorful silk lay scattered across the snow like the petals of a giant, wind-blown rose, the men realized they were seen. Each crate was a message: we see you. We are with you. Hold on. In the town, the civilians shared in the grace. Madame Gervais, the woman who had spent her nights knitting in the dark, stood in her courtyard as a stray white parachute drifted down to snag on the jagged remains of a stone chimney. The silk fluttered in the breeze, soft and ethereal. A young soldier climbed up to retrieve the crate, and when he came down, he handed Madame Gervais a small, rectangular package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a bar of real, dark chocolate and a small bag of sugar. She held the sugar to her nose, inhaling the sweet, dusty scent of a world that wasn't made of ice. She looked at the young soldier, her eyes crinkling into a smile that held a lifetime of resilience. She took his hand and pressed the chocolate back into his palm, nodding toward his tired eyes. They broke the bar in half, standing there in the sunlit ruins, two strangers sharing the sweetness of a miracle. The air in Bastogne began to change. The smell of wood smoke was joined by the rich, toasted aroma of coffee brewing over small, hidden fires. The sound of the wind was joined by the crinkle of cellophane and the quiet, satisfied murmurs of men eating their first real meal in days. A chocolate bar became a feast. A clean bandage became a luxury. A new battery for a radio became a voice from the living. Even the letters that arrived in those crates carried a special weight. These weren't the letters from home, but the small, printed notes tucked into the ration boxes by workers in factories thousands of miles away. Good luck, boys. We're rooting for you. Get home safe. Simple words, written by hands that would never feel the Ardennes frost, but they felt like a warm embrace. As the sun began its slow descent, turning the blue sky into a bruised palette of orange and violet, the fields of Bastogne were a different landscape. The colorful parachutes remained where they had fallen, looking like strange, beautiful markers in the snow. Some men took the discarded silk, wrapping it around their shoulders like regal robes, the bright fabric providing a layer of warmth and a splash of defiance against the gray. The pilots of the silver planes were gone now, flying back to their warm bases, leaving behind a town that had been breathed back to life. They had flown through the clear, dangerous air to deliver a message of hope, and in doing so, they had become a part of the town's quiet history. The night would return, of course. The cold would settle back into the stones, and the ring of iron around the town remained. But the wings of cotton had changed the spirit of the vigil. The watchers in the cellar and the men in the foxholes no longer looked at the ground. They looked up. They remembered that the sky could be blue. They remembered that the sun was still there, waiting behind the clouds. And as the stars began to poke through the deepening dark, reflecting off the colorful silk scattered across the fields, a profound peace settled over Bastogne. It was the peace of the remembered. They had been given the tools to endure, the food to sustain, and the medicine to heal. But more than that, they had been given a moment of pure, unadulterated grace, a vision of flowers falling from a winter sky, proving that even in the heart of the storm, kindness and light can still find a way to land softly in the snow. They tucked themselves into their blankets, some of them new and smelling of the factory, and listened to the wind. It no longer sounded like a mournful sigh. It sounded like the rustle of silk. It sounded like the promise of the march that was still moving toward them, fueled by the same hope that had just fallen from the clouds. They slept a little deeper that night, guarded by the memory of the blue sky and the lingering sweetness of a shared piece of chocolate, waiting for the tomorrow they now knew would surely come. Metal is supposed to be strong, but against the weight of a winter's heart, even the greatest machines feel as fragile as spun glass. As the relief columns of the Third Army pushed closer to the ring of Bastogne, the world became a symphony of iron and ice. It was a slow, grinding progress, measured not in miles, but in inches of frozen mud and the heavy, rhythmic thrum of engines fighting the stillness. The roads had become treacherous ribbons of silver, polished to a mirror shine by the wind and the weight of 1,000 tires. To look upon the column from a distance was to see a long, dark serpent of steel coiling through a landscape of absolute white, its breath rising in great, churning clouds of diesel smoke. Inside the belly of a tank, the world felt very small and very loud. Imagine a man named Silas sitting in the cramped, metallic darkness of his Sherman tank. The air inside was a strange, thick mixture of smells, the sharp, biting scent of cold grease, the heavy aroma of diesel fuel, and the faint, lingering smell of wood smoke from a fire they had shared hours ago. The iron walls of the tank were so cold that if a man were to touch them with a bare hand, the metal would try to claim his skin. Yet, the engine behind Silas was a living, breathing creature. It vibrated through the floorboards, a deep, resonant hum that Silas felt in the marrow of his bones. To him, the tank was not just a weapon, it was a sanctuary of iron. It was a noisy, rattling, freezing home that carried him and his 3 friends through the blizzard. Beside Silas, hunched over the controls, was a boy named Arthur. He was young, his face still holding the softness of home, though his eyes had become as sharp and clear as the winter sky. Arthur's hands, encased in thick, oil-stained gloves, gripped the steering levers with a fierce intensity. He was fighting the ice. Every few minutes, the heavy steel treads of the tank would lose their bite on the frozen road, and the several tons of iron would begin to slide, a slow, terrifying glide toward the steep, snow-filled ditches. Silas watched the back of Arthur's neck, seeing the way the boy's shoulders were bunched with tension. He reached out, his own hand heavy and stiff, and placed it gently on Arthur's shoulder. It was a simple touch, a quiet anchor in the middle of the rattling machine. "Easy, Arthur," Silas whispered, his voice low enough to be a secret, though the roar of the engine nearly swallowed it. "She'll hold. The iron knows the way. Just breathe with her." Arthur took a long, shaky breath, and Silas felt the boy's muscles slowly begin to relax. They didn't speak of the fear that lived in the corners of the tank, the fear of a hidden obstacle in the mist, or the ice giving way beneath them. Instead, they spoke of the iron. They spoke of the machine as if it were a stubborn old mule they were coaxing home. This was the quiet language of courage, spoken in whispers between the clanking of gears and the hiss of the heater. Outside, the ice was a beautiful, terrible thing. It coated the trees until they looked like crystal statues, their branches bowed low as if in prayer. When the wind blew, the forest would click and groan, the sound of thousands of tiny glass bells breaking in the dark. The infantrymen, walking in the shadows of the tanks, used the massive machines as shields against the biting wind. They would reach out as they walked, resting a gloved hand against the cold steel of a passing tank, drawing a strange kind of comfort from its solid, unyielding presence. It was a connection between the flesh and the iron, a shared journey through the deep freeze. In the middle of the afternoon, the column came to a sudden, grinding halt. A bridge ahead, narrow and coated in a thick skin of black ice, stood between them and the next ridge. The engineers moved forward first, their shovels and picks sounding like small, rhythmic drumbeats against the frozen earth. They worked in silence, spreading grit and ash, their faces hidden behind thick woolen scarves. Silas opened the hatch of his tank, and the winter air rushed in, sharp and sweet, instantly clearing the heavy scent of diesel. He looked out over the landscape. To the north, the horizon was a bruised, heavy purple, the color of a storm that refused to break. Somewhere in that haze was the town. Somewhere in that darkness were the boys who were waiting. A young infantryman, no more than 18, was leaning against the side of Silas's tank, trying to light a cigarette with trembling hands. The wind kept snatching the flame away before it could catch. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver lighter, a gift from his father. He leaned over the edge of the hatch, shielding the flame with his large, calloused palm. "Here you go, son," Silas said softly. The boy looked up, his eyes wide and red-rimmed from the wind. He leaned in, the flame catching the tobacco, and took a long, shaking drag. He looked at Silas, and for a fleeting second, the war seemed to vanish. "Thanks, Sarge," the boy murmured. "It's the little things, isn't it?" "It's the only things," Silas replied with a gentle nod. The boy reached into his own coat and pulled out a small, crumpled photograph. He held it up so Silas could see. It was a picture of a girl in a summer dress, standing in a field of tall grass. "She thinks I'm in a quiet place," the boy said, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "I told her in my last letter that the weather was just a bit brisk." Silas looked at the photograph, then at the frozen, jagged world around them. "You didn't lie," he said softly. "It's a quiet place, in its own way. And you're just a man to bring a bit of that summer back to her." The boy tucked the photo away, stood a little straighter, and moved back into the line as the column began to stir. The iron giants groaned back to life, their exhaust plumes blooming like dark winter flowers. The struggle with the ice continued. The tank slid and recovered, the engines roared and sighed, and the men inside held on to one another with quiet words and shared memories. They were a world of iron moving through a world of ice, each one testing the strength of the other. Inside the tank, Silas pulled a small, worn book from a storage bin. It was a collection of poems his wife had given him. He didn't read it for the words, but for the way the paper felt beneath his thumb, soft, familiar, and warm. He thought about the iron of the tank, and how it was made in a factory by people who were likely sleeping in warm beds at this very moment. He thought of the hands that had welded the seams and the hearts that had hoped these machines would bring their boys home. He realized that the iron was not just metal. It was the collective will of a million people, hammered into a shape that could withstand the winter. And the ice was not just weather, it was the final, frozen barrier of a world trying to stop the light. As the sun began to slip behind the hills, casting long, blue shadows across the snow, the column pushed over the crest of the final ridge before the town's outer defenses. The resistance they met was not a roar, but a series of sharp, stinging echoes from the woods, the final, desperate gasps of the winter trying to hold its ground. Inside the tank, the crew worked with a calm, practiced rhythm. There was no shouting, no frantic movements. Silas gave his orders in a low, soothing tone, his voice a steadying hand on the nerves of his men. "Left a bit, Arthur. Watch the edge. There's a soft patch of drift there. Steady now. We're almost through the gate." They felt the impact of the elements more than the conflict itself. The iron of the tank would ring when struck by the cold, a high, lonely note that vibrated through the hull. But the men didn't flinch. They were wrapped in their private thoughts, their letters, and their quiet resilience. At one point, the tank lurched violently, its right tread spinning on a hidden patch of sheer ice. The machine tilted dangerously toward a steep embankment. For a heartbeat, the world hung in the balance. Arthur let out a sharp, indrawn breath. Silas didn't move. He kept his hand on Arthur's shoulder. "Wait for it," he whispered. "Let her settle. Trust the weight." The tank groaned, the metal complaining with a series of loud, metallic pops. And then, slowly, the heavy treads found a bit of frozen earth beneath the ice. The machine leveled out, the engine gave a triumphant growl, and they moved forward once more. Arthur let out a long exhale, his forehead resting against the cold periscope for a second. That was close, Silas. The iron likes to keep us on our toes, Silas said with a small, tired chuckle. Keeps the blood moving. They were exhausted, their eyes burning, their bodies feeling as though they had been beaten with hammers. But they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. They knew that every turn of the treads was a heartbeat for the men in the town. They were the iron heart of the rescue, and the ice was beginning to crack. As the night fell, absolute and cold, the column didn't disappear. The tiny red cat's eye lights on the back of the vehicles glowed like embers in the dark, a long, winding trail of hope. The men inside the iron shells shared a final piece of chocolate, a final sip of lukewarm coffee, and a final quiet word of encouragement. Tomorrow, we'll be there, Silas said, looking at the three men in the dim, amber light of the cabin. Tomorrow, we'll see the houses. We'll see the people. And we'll tell them the winter is over. The tank rumbled on, a steady, rhythmic pulse in the middle of the frozen wilderness. The iron was cold, and the ice was deep, but the fire inside the men was unquenchable. They moved forward through the shadows, a procession of tired giants carrying the warmth of the world into the heart of the storm. And as they moved, the ice seemed to soften beneath them, yielding to the persistence of the iron and the quiet, invincible courage of the boys who refused to let the winter win. The relief was no longer a plan on a map. It was a physical reality, a grinding, beautiful force of nature, moving steadily toward the dawn. Silas closed his eyes for a brief moment, listening to the heartbeat of the engine, and he could almost hear the sound of a spring thaw, far off in the distance, waiting for them to arrive. The light of a single candle is a small thing, yet in a room made of shadows and winter, it becomes the very center of the world. Just behind the lines of the advancing Third Army, where the rumble of heavy trucks and the clanking of tank treads faded into a muffled, snowy hum, stood a small, stone barn. Its walls were thick and ancient, built by farmers who had long since vanished, and its roof groaned under the weight of a week's worth of unfallen snow. Inside, the air was a strange tapestry of scents, the sweet, lingering ghost of dry hay, the sharp, biting sting of rubbing alcohol, and the heavy, earthy smell of damp wool. This was a sanctuary. It was not a place of grand speeches or heroic charges, but a place of hushed voices and steady hands. In the center of the main floor, huddled away from the biting drafts that whistled through the wooden eaves, sat Dr. Samuel. He was a man whose face was a map of exhaustion, etched with deep lines that seemed to hold the stories of every boy who had crossed his threshold. Back home, in a quiet village where the hills were green and the pace of life was measured by the seasons, Samuel was the man you called for a scraped knee or a stubborn cough. He was a man of gardens and slow Sunday walks. Now, his world had narrowed to the small, golden circle of light cast by a thick beeswax candle perched on a wooden crate. Samuel's hands were large, with blunt fingers that looked better suited for tilling soil than the delicate work they performed now. But as he leaned over the makeshift table, his movements were as light and precise as a weaver's. He worked in a silence so profound that he could hear the rhythmic, shallow breathing of the young men lying on the straw around him. Imagine the weight of that silence. It was not an empty quiet, but a space filled with the private thoughts and silent prayers of those who waited. On the table before him lay a boy named David. David was barely 19, with a dusting of freckles across a nose that was currently pale with the cold. He was far from his mother's kitchen, far from the girl he had promised to marry when the leaves turned gold again. He lay perfectly still, his eyes closed, drifting in the hazy, velvet borderland between sleep and waking. Samuel didn't just see a patient. He saw a son. He saw a future. As he worked to mend what the winter had broken, he spoke to David in a voice that was little more than a whisper, a low, soothing baritone that acted as a bridge back to the world of the living. "You're doing so well, David," Samuel murmured, his words floating like soft feathers in the dim light. "Just stay with me. Think of the sun on your face. Think of that porch swing you told me about. The wood is warm, isn't it? You can feel the breeze coming off the clover fields. Beside the doctor stood a young soldier named Henry, who had been pressed into service as an assistant. Henry's job was simple, yet vital. He held the candle. His hands shook with the cold and the overwhelming weight of the moment, but he kept that flame steady. He watched the light dance in the doctor's eyes, and in that flickering glow, he found his own measure of courage. Every few minutes, the flame would gutter in a sudden draft, casting long, jumping shadows against the stone walls. In those moments, the barn seemed to expand, the darkness pressing in like a physical weight. But the candle always recovered. It was a stubborn little light, a tiny sun that refused to be extinguished by the vast, frozen night. Samuel's mind would sometimes wander as he worked, drifting away from the metallic scent of his instruments and the chill in his bones. He thought of his own study at home, the walls lined with books that smelled of old paper and wisdom. He thought of the way the light looked through the stained glass of the local church on a winter morning. These memories were his fuel. They kept his hand steady when his heart felt heavy. He knew that outside these walls, the great machinery of the Third Army was churning through the ice. He knew that miles ahead, the town of Bastogne was holding its breath, waiting for the relief that was carving its way through the snow. But here, in the barn, the war didn't exist in maps or strategies. It existed in the softness of a bandage, the warmth of a shared blanket, and the quiet resilience of a heart that refused to stop beating. There was an everyday heroism in the way the men in the barn cared for one another. A soldier who was only slightly wounded would spend his hour of rest sitting by the side of a stranger, wetting his lips with a damp cloth or adjusting a coat to better cover a shivering shoulder. They shared their private fears in the dark, whispered confessions of how much they missed their fathers, or the secret letters they had tucked into their boots just in case. One boy, sitting in the corner with a bandaged hand, was reading a letter by the faint, reflected light of the doctor's station. It was a letter from his little sister, filled with news of a new kitten and the way the snow looked like powdered sugar on the fence posts. He read it over and over, his lips moving silently with the words. That piece of paper was his armor, a thin, crinkled shield against the cold. Dr. Samuel finished his work on David's arm, his fingers moving with a gentle finality as he tied the last stitch. He leaned back for a moment, his eyes closing, letting the warmth of the candle rest against his eyelids. He felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for the victory of the march, but for the quiet victory of this one life, still here, still breathing in the dark. He reached out and rested a hand on David's forehead. The fever was receding, replaced by the cool, steady touch of a restorative sleep. Sleep now, son, Samuel whispered. The morning is coming, and you'll be there to see it. Henry, still holding the candle, looked at the doctor. Do you think they'll make it, sir? The ones in the town? Samuel looked at the small, brave flame of the candle. He saw the way it illuminated the faces of the men in the straw, turning the grim reality of the barn into a scene of golden, quiet peace. I think, Samuel said softly, his voice a gentle lullaby, that as long as there is one person willing to hold a light for another, there is nothing the winter can do to stop us. We are moving forward, Henry. Not just with tanks and guns, but with this. With the way we look after one another. The night wore on, the candle burning lower and lower, until it was only a small pool of wax and a determined, tiny wick. But as the first, pale hint of gray began to touch the edges of the barn's wooden doors, Samuel didn't feel the need for more light. The darkness was beginning to lift, not just from the sky, but from the hearts of the men in his care. He watched as the light of the coming dawn began to replace the golden glow of the beeswax. The shadows retreated into the corners, and the ancient stone of the barn began to glow with a soft, pearlescent light. David stirred in his sleep, a small, peaceful sigh escaping his lips. Samuel stood up slowly, his joints popping, his back ached with a dull, familiar thrum. He walked to the door and pulled it open just a crack. Outside, the world was a vision of white and silver. The trees were encrusted with frost, looking like delicate sculptures of lace. The air was perfectly still, the silence of the forest a beautiful, expectant thing. Far off in the distance, he heard the low, rhythmic pulse of an engine, the heartbeat of the Third Army, moving ever closer to the goal. He turned back to the room. The men were beginning to wake, the quiet murmurs of the morning filling the space where the silence of the night had been. Henry was finally setting the candle down, his task finished, his face lit with a weary, triumphant smile. Samuel realized then that he wasn't just a doctor in a war. He was a keeper of the light. Every life he touched, every wound he tended, was a candle he was lighting against the darkness. And as the sun finally broke over the horizon, flooding the barn with a brilliant, warming gold, he knew that the shadows had lost. The surgeon's candle had done its work. It had held the night at bay just long enough for the world to find its way back to the morning. And in that soft, early light, as the first bird began to sing in the frozen pines, Samuel felt a peace that surpassed all understanding. He was tired, yes. He was cold. But he was alive, and he was part of a story that was being written in kindness, one whispered word and one steady hand at a time. He took a deep breath of the freezing morning air, feeling it clean and sharp in his lungs, and he smiled. It was a beautiful day to be a part of the light. The march would continue. The town would be reached. But for this moment, in the quiet of a Belgian barn, the world was exactly as it should be, warm, hopeful, and waking up to the grace of a new beginning. The horizon was no longer a ghost, it was a promise etched in iron and ice. There is a strange, heavy beauty in the final few miles of a long journey, especially when every step has been a quiet battle against the world itself. The relief column had been moving for what felt like an eternity, leaving behind the rolling hills and entering the deep, jagged heart of the Ardennes. The distance between the rescuers and the rescued had shrunk until it could be measured in the low, rhythmic thrum of the heart. Just over the next ridge, just beyond the next stand of blackened pines, lay the town that had become a symbol of everything worth saving. But these final miles were not a celebratory parade. They were a path carved in frost, a slow and deliberate unspooling of human will against an environment that wanted nothing more than to stay frozen and still. Imagine the woods as they looked in those final, perilous hours. The trees stood like ancient guardians, their boughs heavy with layers of snow that had never been disturbed by the sun. The air was so cold it felt brittle, like a sheet of glass that might shatter if a man spoke too loudly. The only sounds were the ones the column brought with it, the deep, guttural moan of the tank engines, the metallic clink of canteens against belts, and the endless, hypnotic crunch of thousands of boots breaking through the icy crust of the earth. In this moving river of olive wool and steel, there was a young man named Joseph. He was a quiet soul from the mountains of Virginia, a man who knew the language of the woods, but even he had never seen a winter this hungry. His breath drifted before him in a constant, silver cloud, and his eyelashes were tipped with tiny pearls of frost. Every muscle in his body ached with a dull, heavy fire, the kind of exhaustion that settles into the bones and refuses to leave. But Joseph didn't look at his feet, and he didn't look at the miles behind him. He looked ahead, his eyes searching the gaps in the trees for any sign of a chimney, a roof, or a wisp of smoke. Joseph was carrying something precious in the pocket of his coat. It wasn't a map or compass, though he had those too. It was a letter he had started 3 days ago, a letter to his younger brother who was still at home, dreaming of adventures. Joseph had written about the silence of the Belgian forest, but he hadn't told him about the fear. He had written about the way the light looked at twilight, turning the snow into a field of lavender and blue. He carried that letter like a charm, a piece of his home that he was determined to bring through the frost. It was his anchor, the thing that kept his legs moving when the wind tried to push him back. Around him, the other men moved in a similar trance of resilience. There was a profound, shared understanding that they were close now. They could feel the weight of the town's struggle pressing against them, a silent plea carried on the freezing wind. They weren't just soldiers anymore, they were a lifeline. Each man was a single thread in a great, warm rope being thrown across a frozen chasm. The peril of these last miles lay in the unseen. The snow was a deceptive blanket, hiding deep ruts and jagged rocks that could snap an axle or twist an ankle in a heartbeat. The tanks, those great iron giants, groaned as they tilted on the icy slopes, their treads searching for a grip that wasn't there. It was a slow, mechanical struggle, a dance of weight and friction played out in the dark. During a brief halt, Joseph saw a tank driver named Miller climb out of his hatch. Miller's face was smeared with oil and soot, his eyes red-rimmed from the strain of steering a 40-ton beast through a needle's eye. He stood on the fender of his tank, looking out at the white waste. Joseph stepped toward him and offered a small, crumpled piece of chocolate he had been saving since the French border. Miller took it with a hand that was shaking slightly from the cold. He didn't say thank you, he didn't have to. He just broke the chocolate in half and gave the other piece back to Joseph. They stood there for a moment in the deep, blue shadow of the tank, chewing the frozen sweetness in silence. It was a small moment of kindness, a tiny flicker of warmth in a world that felt entirely drained of it. In that moment, they weren't part of a grand army, they were just two tired men sharing a bit of sugar and a breath of air, acknowledging that they were still here, still moving, still human. As the column started again, the path became even steeper. The frost had turned the road into a ribbon of black glass. The men on foot had to dig their heels in, leaning their bodies forward until their chests were almost parallel to the ground. They used the stocks of their rifles as walking sticks, the wood cold against their palms. No one complained. There was a fierce, quiet pride in the way they moved. They were carving this path not just for themselves, but for the boys they knew were waiting in the cellars of Bastogne. They imagined those boys looking at their watches, listening for the sound of these very engines, hoping against hope that the world hadn't forgotten them. Joseph thought of the men in the town. He didn't know their names, but he knew their faces. He had seen them in the training camps, in the muddy fields of England, and in the rain-soaked hedgerows of Normandy. They were the same boys who liked to talk about their cars back home, the same boys who would complain about the coffee and then share their last cigarette. The thought of them sitting in the dark, surrounded by the cold, made Joseph's heart ache with a protective fury. He dug his boots deeper into the snow, ignoring the sharp pain in his knees. Every yard he gained was a yard closer to bringing them home. The forest began to thin as they reached the crest of a long, jagged ridge. The wind here was different, it was stronger, carrying the scent of something other than pine and ice. It carried the faint, metallic tang of wood smoke in the distant, muffled sound of a world being torn apart. Joseph felt a shiver go down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was it. The final descent. Below them, the landscape opened up into a series of white fields, dotted with the dark skeletons of burnt-out farmhouses and the jagged lines of stone walls. The path ahead was visible now, a winding, silver trail leading toward a cluster of gray shapes on the horizon. It looked so close, yet the distance was still guarded by the unyielding frost and the hidden dangers of the valley. The heroism of these miles was found in the silence. It was found in the medic who walked at the back of the line, his eyes constantly scanning the men for the telltale signs of a mind beginning to wander or a body beginning to fail. It was found in the sergeant who walked up and down the column, his voice a low, steady murmur of encouragement, touching a shoulder here, adjusting a strap there. It was found in the men who, despite their own shivering, would offer a hand to pull a comrade out of a drift, their fingers locking together in a grip that defied the ice. The sun began to set, casting long, violet shadows across the valley. The sky turned a deep, bruised indigo, and the first few stars began to prick through the haze. The column didn't stop. They turned on their tiny, hooded lights, the small red and white glows looking like a string of jewels draped across the snow. They moved through the twilight like ghosts, their silhouettes blurred by the rising mist. In the cab of one of the lead trucks, a driver named Elias gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. He was peering through a windshield that was half covered in ice, his eyes searching for the tracks of the vehicles ahead. Beside him sat a young officer who was staring at a map by the light of a tiny, shielded flashlight. How far now? Elias whispered, his voice cracking from the dry, cold air. The officer looked up, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the bulb. 2 miles. Maybe less. We're on their doorstep, Elias. We just have to find the key. Elias nodded, shifting the truck into a lower gear as they began the final, treacherous crawl down the ridge. He thought of his wife back in Ohio, of the way she would leave a light on in the porch whenever he was late coming home from work. He imagined that porch light now, shining out over the Belgian snow, guiding him toward the town. He whispered her name under his breath, a soft prayer for safety and for the strength to finish what they had started. The path carved in frost was nearly complete. Behind them lay miles of struggle, of ice, and of the bitter, biting wind. Ahead lay the unknown. But as the column moved into the final valley, the atmosphere changed. The exhaustion was still there, the cold was still there, but there was a new, electric energy thrumming through the men. They could feel the proximity of their brothers. They could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them, a golden, heavy gravity. Joseph felt the letter in his pocket, the paper stiff and cold. He imagined himself sitting in a warm room tomorrow, finishing the letter, telling his brother that they had made it. He imagined the look on the faces of the men in Bastogne when they saw the first olive drab shape emerge from the mist. He imagined the handshake, the shared cup of water, and the quiet, profound realization that the night was finally over. They were the rescue. They were the answer to the prayer whispered in the cellar. And as they moved forward into the deepening dark, their boots continuing their rhythmic, persistent crunch on the snow, they were no longer just men. They were a force of nature, a warmth that the winter could not extinguish, a light that was carving its way through the frost, one slow, deliberate, and beautiful step at a time. The distance was gone. The door was right there. All they had to do was keep walking. Every stone in this small village had a memory, but tonight, they only held the cold. As the relief column drew closer to the heart of the storm, the thick, ancient forests of the Ardennes began to give way to the small, scattered hamlets that stood like quiet sentinels on the outskirts of Bastogne. One such place was a tiny cluster of gray stone houses, a village that had stood for hundreds of years, weathering the slow turn of seasons and the gentle passage of time. In the soft, hazy light of a winter's afternoon, the village looked like a drawing in an old book, its steeply pitched roofs and narrow chimneys silhouetted against a sky of bruised violet. But the peace of this place was a fragile thing, a beautiful mask for the struggle that was unfolding within its walls. The stones here were heavy and cold, carved by hands that had long since returned to the earth. They were stones meant for life, for keeping out the wind while a family gathered around a hearth, for sheltering the livestock in the deep of night, for standing firm while children played in the cobbled squares. Now, those same stones were being asked to do something different. They were being asked to become a shield. Imagine a young soldier named Jack. He was a boy who understood the weight of a stone. Back in the rolling hills of Vermont, his father was a mason, a man who spoke in the language of granite and lime. Jack had spent his teenage summers helping his father mend the low walls that wound through the green pastures of home. He knew the rough texture of a cold rock in the morning, and the way a wall, if built with care, could last through a century of winters. Now, Jack found himself huddled behind the corner of a shattered farmhouse in this foreign hamlet. The air was thick with the scent of old mortar dust and the sharp, metallic tang of the winter air. The village, once so full of the quiet sounds of life, was now a landscape of shadows and sudden, flickering lights. The struggle in the village of stone was not a loud or frantic thing in Jack's mind. It was a slow, deliberate series of moments. It was the feeling of his boots slipping on the icy cobbles. It was the way his breath came in ragged, white clouds, catching the light of a distant, smoldering fire. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of his own heart, a steady drumbeat that kept him anchored to the present. He wasn't thinking about the maps of the generals or the grand movements of the Third Army. His world had shrunk to the space of a single street, to the jagged edge of a stone wall, and to the man crouching beside him. That man was named Arthur, a sergeant who had seen too many winters. Arthur didn't move like a soldier in a storybook. He moved like a man trying not to disturb the ghosts of the village. He moved with a quiet, careful grace, his eyes scanning the windows and the doorways for anything that didn't belong to the shadows. When the light from a distant flash illuminated the square, Jack saw Arthur's face. It was a face etched with a profound, weary kindness. In that moment of sudden clarity, Jack realized that Arthur wasn't fighting for a piece of ground or a line on a map. He was fighting for the boys who were with him. He was the wall. He was the stone that wouldn't break. As they moved deeper into the village, the ruins began to speak. They found a small, wooden chair sitting miraculously untouched in the middle of a street filled with rubble. It was a simple chair, painted a soft, fading blue, looking as though its owner had just stepped away for a moment to check the stove. Jack looked at that chair and felt a sudden, sharp ache in his chest. It was a reminder of the life that had been here, the quiet mornings, the shared meals, the simple comfort of a home. He reached out as he passed, his gloved hand brushing the cold wood of the chair. It was a small, silent act of reverence, a way of acknowledging the humanity that still lingered in the wreckage. He wasn't just a soldier in a uniform, he was a guest in a broken house, and he moved with the quiet respect of a man walking through a cathedral. The heroism in the village of stone was found in the spaces between the flashes of light. It was found in the way a man would share his last bit of warmth, leaning his shoulder against a friend to block the wind. It was found in the whispers that traveled from doorway to doorway, low, soothing words of encouragement that kept the fear from settling too deeply. At one point, Jack and Arthur found themselves sheltered in what had once been a small stable. The air inside still smelled faintly of dry hay and old wood. They sat in the dark, their backs against the cold stone, listening to the wind howl through the gaps in the roof. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, dented tin. He opened it with a quiet click, revealing a few dry crackers and a small square of chocolate that had turned white with age. He didn't eat it. Instead, he broke the chocolate in two and handed half to Jack. "My daughter sent this," Arthur whispered, his voice as soft as the falling snow. "In a letter I got back in France. She told me to save it for a special occasion." Jack took the chocolate, the sweetness a sudden, beautiful shock to his senses. "What's the occasion, Sarge?" Arthur leaned his head back against the stone, a small, tired smile touching his lips. "We're still here, Jack. We're in the village. And tomorrow, we're going to see the sun. I'd say that's a special occasion." They sat in the quiet of the stable, two men sharing a child's gift in the middle of a ruins. The stone walls around them, once meant to hold life, were now holding their courage. Jack felt a strange, deep peace wash over him. He realized that strength wasn't about being louder than the storm. It was about being like the stone, quiet, steady, and unyielding. It was the strength to hold on to your kindness when everything else was being torn away. The struggle continued through the night, a dance of light and shadow in the narrow streets. The men of the Third Army moved through the ruins like ghosts, their boots muffled by the fresh snow. They were ordinary men, carpenters and clerks, masons and farmers, who were finding an extraordinary strength within themselves. They were the relief, and they were the promise that the winter would not have the final word. Every doorway they cleared, every stone wall they held, brought them closer to the ring of Bastogne. They could feel the proximity of the town now, a presence just beyond the frozen fields. The village was the gateway, the final hurdle before the breakthrough. As the darkest part of the night began to fade into a deep, bruised gray, the village grew quiet. The snow fell in large, lazy flakes, covering the rubble and the ruins in a soft, white blanket. The jagged edges of the broken houses were softened, turned into ethereal shapes by the mist. Jack stood in the middle of the village square, leaning on his rifle. He looked at the stone houses, their walls scarred and broken, yet still standing. He thought of his father's walls back in Vermont. He realized that a wall isn't just made of stone and mortar. It's made of the intention of the man who built it. These houses had been built with the intention of shelter, and even in their ruin, they were still providing it. He looked at Arthur, who was standing a few yards away, staring toward the north. The sergeant's coat was covered in a layer of white, making him look like a statue carved from the very stone of the village. "The road is open, Jack," Arthur said softly. Jack followed his gaze. Beyond the village, the road stretched out into the gray mist, a pale ribbon leading toward the horizon. The way was clear. The struggle in the hamlet had ended, not with a roar, but with the quiet, persistent resilience of men who refused to break. They began to move out of the village, the long column of olive-drab figures winding past the shattered stone. Jack looked back one last time at the small, blue chair sitting in the snow. He whispered a quiet promise to the empty square, a promise that the life that had been here would return, that the stones would once again hold the warmth of a hearth, and that the silence of the winter would eventually be replaced by the sounds of a town waking up to peace. The extraordinary strength they had found in the ruins was something they would carry with them. It was a strength born of small kindnesses and shared chocolates, of quiet whispers and the steady weight of a hand on a shoulder. It was the strength of the stone, and it was the strength of the human heart. As they stepped onto the road to Bastogne, the sun finally began to touch the tops of the trees, casting a pale, golden light over the snow. The village of stone was behind them now, a memory of shadow and resilience. Ahead lay the town, and the brothers who were waiting for the light. Jack took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs with a clean, sharp hope. He adjusted the strap of his rifle and stepped into the rhythm of the march. He was tired, he was cold, and he was far from home. But as he walked, he felt the solid, unshakable weight of the courage he had found among the ruins. He was a part of the relief, a part of the light, and he knew, with a quiet certainty, that the morning had finally arrived. The stones of the village would remain, holding the story of the night the winter tried to stop the world. And the men who walked past them would carry that story into the future, a testament to the fact that even in the deepest dark, the most ordinary of hearts can find the strength to stand like stone. They marched on, into the soft light of the new day, their footsteps a gentle, persistent drumbeat on the road to the breakthrough. The breaking of a great siege does not always sound like thunder. Sometimes, it is as quiet as a single footstep in the untouched snow. For so many long, bitter days, the town of Bastogne had been an island enclosed by an invisible wall of iron and ice. The men inside had grown accustomed to the profound, heavy isolation. They had learned to live within the shell, measuring their lives in the slow rationing of shivering breaths, the sharing of a single, frayed blanket, and the quiet, nightly recitation of memories from home. They had built a world entirely out of endurance, waiting in the pale, gray fog for a dawn they were never entirely sure would come. But on this particular morning, the air felt different. The biting wind that had howled through the pine branches for weeks had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a stillness so absolute it felt sacred. The fog, usually a thick, suffocating blanket, had thinned into delicate, silver ribbons that drifted lazily over the frozen pastures on the southern edge of the town. In a shallow, frost-hardened foxhole at the very edge of the defensive line, a young man named Charlie stood the morning watch. Charlie was from a place where the earth was red and warm, a boy who had once spent his summers fixing tractors and listening to the cicadas sing in the tall grass. Now, he was wrapped in so many layers of stiff, damp wool that he could barely bend his arms. His helmet felt incredibly heavy, and his eyes burned with the deep, sandy ache of far too many sleepless nights. He leaned against the frozen dirt wall of his trench, staring out across a wide, flat meadow of pure white. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was simply watching the mist shift, his mind drifting, as it so often did, back to his mother's kitchen. He was holding a letter in his pocket, a piece of paper he had read so many times in the dark that the folds were beginning to tear. He didn't need to look at the words anymore. He carried them in his heart, a quiet, glowing ember that had kept him alive. Across that same snowy meadow, hidden just within the shadows of the ancient, towering spruce trees, stood a scout from the relief column. His name was Benjamin. Benjamin had walked through a frozen hell to get here. He had shoveled snow until his hands bled, he had pushed heavy trucks out of ditches in the dead of night, and he had watched the men around him give everything they had to carve a path through the winter. Benjamin leaned his shoulder against the rough bark of a tree, his breath pluming softly in the cold air. He was tired in a way that defied description. It was an exhaustion that settled deep into the marrow, a weariness that made the simple act of keeping his eyes open feel like moving a mountain. But as he looked through the gaps in the branches, he saw the faint, jagged outlines of rooftops in the distance. He saw the ruined steeple of a church rising above the morning mist. He knew, with a sudden, quiet certainty, that the journey was over. They had arrived. Benjamin didn't shout. He didn't raise his rifle in triumph or call back to the men resting in the woods behind him. The moment was too fragile, too deeply intimate for noise. He simply stepped out from the shelter of the trees and into the open, snowy field. From his foxhole, Charlie saw the movement. For a fraction of a second, his heart gave a sudden, panicked flutter, a reflex born of days of constant vigilance. But as the figure emerged from the mist, Charlie's hands remained still. He didn't raise his weapon. He just stared. The silhouette moving through the snow was not advancing with the cautious, menacing crouch of a threat. It was walking with a slow, heavy, profoundly weary trudge. The posture was intimately familiar. It was the universal shape of a boy who has carried too much weight for far too long. And as the figure drew closer, the morning light caught the distinct, rounded shape of his helmet and the olive-drab color of his heavy coat. Charlie slowly stood up. His joints popped, stiff from the freezing damp, and his boots crunched softly against the ice at the bottom of his trench. He placed his hands on the snow-covered edge of the foxhole and pulled himself up, stepping out into the open meadow. The distance between them was perhaps 100 yards. It was a stretch of pristine, untouched snow, a blank canvas separating the rescuers from the rescued. Benjamin saw the boy step out of the ground. He stopped for a moment, his chest heaving, his eyes wide. Then, he took another step forward. They walked toward each other with a painful, agonizing slowness. There was no running. There was no sudden rush of adrenaline. They were simply too tired. They waded through the knee-deep drifts, their boots leaving a winding, erratic trail in the powder behind them. The only sound in the entire world was the soft, rhythmic swish of their coats brushing against the snow, and the quiet, heavy intake of their breaths. As they closed the distance, they began to see each other clearly. Benjamin saw a boy whose face was darkened with days of soot and unwashed grime, his eyes hollowed out by hunger and cold, yet burning with a fierce, quiet light. Charlie saw a man whose coat was stiff with frozen mud, his jaw covered in a thick, dark scruff, his shoulders slumped with the incredible burden of the miles he had marched. They were strangers, born in different parts of a vast country, living entirely different lives before the world broke apart. But in this quiet, frozen meadow, they were brothers. They stopped when they were just an arm's length apart. For a long, beautiful moment, they simply looked at one another. The air between them felt thick with unspoken words, a heavy, golden gravity pulling the broken pieces of the world back together. Benjamin slowly lifted his right hand. His fingers were stiff, encased in a thick, wool-lined glove. With careful, deliberate movements, he pulled the glove off, tucking it beneath his left arm. He wanted to feel this. He needed to know it was real. Charlie looked down at Benjamin's bare hand, then slowly raised his own. He stripped away his worn, dirt-stained mitten, exposing skin that was pale and cracked from the frost. He reached out. When their hands met, there was no dramatic clap, no overwhelming embrace. It was just a firm, quiet grip. Skin against skin. Warmth meeting warmth. In that simple, profound point of contact, the invisible wall that had surrounded Bastogne finally cracked and fell away. The shell was broken. The isolation was over. Glad to see you, Benjamin whispered, his voice a dry, rasping croak that held all the emotion in the world. Charlie gripped his hand a little tighter, a slow, trembling smile breaking through the grime on his face. Glad to be seen, he murmured back. We were starting to wonder if the rest of the world was still out there. We're here, Benjamin said softly. The whole army is right behind me. We brought you some coffee. Charlie let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. He closed his eyes, and a single tear slipped free, cutting a clean, pale track down his soot-stained cheek. He didn't bother to wipe it away. Coffee sounds just about perfect, he whispered. There were no cheers. There was no grand celebration. The profound relief of the moment was too heavy for jubilation. It was a quiet, holy thing. Slowly, as if summoned by that single handshake, other figures began to emerge from the mist. From the tree lane, more men from the relief column stepped into the meadow, their faces painted with the same mixture of exhaustion and awe. And from the snow-covered foxholes and ruined cellars of the town, the defenders rose, standing tall in the daylight for the first time in over a week. They drifted toward each other across the white field, two rivers of tired, shivering boys finally blending into one. The greetings were all the same. Quiet murmurs. A hand placed gently on a shoulder. A shared gaze that communicated volumes of suffering and survival. Benjamin reached into his heavy pack and pulled out a small, dented tin of peach halves he had been saving since they left the French valleys. He pressed it into Charlie's hands without a word. Charlie looked at the bright, colorful label, a splash of summer in the deep winter, and then looked back at Benjamin with a gratitude so deep it defied language. All around them, small acts of everyday heroism unfolded in the snow. Men who had just marched through a blizzard were opening their canteens and offering their last drops of water to men who had been eating snow for days. Men who had been hoarding their last cigarettes were suddenly passing them freely, lighting them with cupped hands against the faint morning breeze. They sat down together in the snow right there in the meadow. They didn't rush into the town, and they didn't hurry back to the warm trucks. They just wanted to sit in the quiet aftermath of the miracle. A young medic from the relief force knelt beside a defender whose boots were frozen solid, gently beginning to work the laces free with patient, careful fingers. Two older sergeants sat back to back, leaning against each other for support, looking up at the sky as the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a warm, golden wash over the white earth. In these quiet moments, the true nature of their victory was revealed. It wasn't about the miles conquered or the enemy pushed back. It was about the preservation of humanity. It was about the boys who had held the line in the dark, and the boys who had refused to stop walking until they found them. It was about the invisible, unbreakable threads of love and duty that tie people together, even when the world freezes over. Charlie sat in the snow beside Benjamin, opening the tin of peaches with a small metal key. He offered the first slice to his rescuer. Benjamin shook his head, a soft smile on his lips, gesturing for Charlie to eat it. As Charlie tasted the sweet, golden syrup, he reached into his pocket and touched the letter from his mother. For the first time in days, he didn't just feel the paper. He felt the promise of it. He knew now that the letter would have a response. He knew that the mail trucks would come again, that the roads were open, and that he would eventually see the red earth of his home. The siege was over. The great, terrifying storm had broken against the quiet resilience of ordinary men. And as the morning sun climbed higher, bathing the snowy meadow and the ruined town in a gentle, thawing light, the boys of the Third Army and the defenders of Bastogne sat together in peace. They had survived the deepest dark, and they had found each other in the dawn, proving with a simple, exhausted handshake that no matter how thick the ice, the warmth of the human spirit can always find a way to crack the shell. There is a warmth that comes not from a glowing hearth, but from the sudden, overwhelming certainty that you have not been forgotten. When the great, heavy supply trucks finally rolled into the center of Bastogne, they did not arrive with the triumphant blast of horns or the marching rhythm of a parade. They came slowly, their massive, snow-chained tires crunching over the iced cobblestones with a deep, reverent sigh. They looked like exhausted beasts of burden, their olive-drab paint hidden beneath thick layers of frozen mud and white frost, their canvas covers sagging under the weight of the winter. But to the eyes of the men and women who emerged from the shadows to greet them, these battered machines were chariots of pure, impossible grace. From the darkened cellars, from the ruined doorways, and from the shallow, frozen trenches at the edge of the woods, the defenders stepped into the pale winter light. They moved like sleepwalkers, their steps hesitant and slow. For so many days, every sound of a motor had been a threat, every shadow a reason to hide. Now, they stood in the open squares of the shattered town, blinking against the glare of the snow, watching the long line of trucks wind its way through the debris. A young boy named Julian, whose uniform was little more than a collection of ragged, soot-stained threads, walked up to the very first truck in the line. He didn't speak to the driver. He didn't ask for anything. He simply reached out with a trembling, bare hand and placed his palm flat against the massive steel hood of the engine. The metal was vibrating. It was incredibly, wonderfully hot. Julian closed his eyes, letting the mechanical heat seep into his frozen skin, traveling up his arm and settling deep within his chest. It was the heat of the outside world, the heat of a machine that had driven through the impossible to reach him. He leaned his forehead against the warm iron and let out a long, shuddering breath. Behind the trucks, the tailgates began to drop with heavy, metallic clangs that echoed beautifully off the broken stone walls. And then, carried on the gentle afternoon breeze, came a scent that stopped the entire town in its tracks. It was the rich, earthy, unimaginably beautiful aroma of real coffee. Not the weak, bitter water boiled over smokeless fires, but dark, roasted coffee, brewing in massive metal vats. Mingled with it was the smell of hot soup, thick with vegetables and preserved meats, and the sweet, yeasty perfume of freshly baked bread. The cooks of the relief column, men whose own faces were drawn with the exhaustion of the journey, began to ladle the food into any vessel the defenders could find. They filled battered tin cups, empty ration cans, and cracked porcelain bowls brought up from the cellars by the townspeople. There was very little talking. The sheer, overwhelming sensation of a warm meal after weeks of hollow, aching hunger was too profound for words. A soldier named Arthur took his tin cup of soup and walked a few paces away, finding a quiet corner against a ruined wall. He cradled the hot metal in both hands, letting it burn his palms just a little, savoring the sting. He took a slow sip. The warmth traveled down his throat like a liquid sun, spreading a slow, heavy comfort through his core. He closed his eyes, chewing a piece of soft, white bread, and felt a strange, tight knot in his stomach, a knot tied by fear and starvation, finally begin to loosen and dissolve. Beside him, an elderly woman of the village, her shoulders wrapped in a beautifully knitted shawl, was handed a steaming cup of tea and a biscuit. She looked at the young cook who had given it to her, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and gently touched his cheek with a hand as light as a falling leaf. It was a silent, holy communion in the snow. But the most precious cargo the trucks carried that day was not the food, nor the thick woolen blankets, nor the medicine. The greatest treasure was hauled out in heavy, dull green canvas sacks. The mail had arrived. When the call went out that there were letters from home, the quiet reverence of the meal shifted into a desperate, hopeful gathering. The sergeants stood on the tailgates of the trucks, their voices hoarse but steady, calling out names into the freezing air. With every name, a man would step forward from the crowd, his hands reaching out with a fragile, trembling urgency. For the men who had been trapped in the white void, cut off from the earth, these letters were lifelines. They were proof that the world they had left behind still existed, that it was still turning, and that there was a place waiting for them to return. Imagine a boy named Henry, standing near the edge of the square. He was so young, and the war had aged him so quickly, leaving dark shadows beneath his eyes and a quiet sorrow in his posture. When his name was called, he took the small, white envelope as if it were made of spun glass. He didn't open it immediately. He walked away from the crowd, seeking the sanctuary of an abandoned, roofless church. He sat down on a snow-covered stone pew. His fingers were too numb, too clumsy with the cold, to open the envelope delicately. He tore the edge with a quiet, desperate sound. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. It was from his mother. Henry brought the paper close to his face. He could smell a faint trace of lavender soap in the musty, sweet scent of the wooden desk in their hallway. He began to read. She wrote about the snow falling in their own front yard, about how his father had finally fixed the squeaky hinge on the front door, and about the neighbor's dog who kept digging under the fence. She wrote about mundane, beautiful, ordinary things. And at the very bottom, in her sweeping, elegant script, she wrote, "We leave the porch light on for you every night, my sweet boy. You are always in our hearts. Come home soon." As Henry read those words, something inside him broke. It was not a violent breaking, but a gentle, necessary shattering. For weeks, he had held himself together with a rigid, brittle courage. He had not cried when the earth shook with artillery. He had not cried when the cold seeped into his bones, or when the hunger made his hands shake. He had locked his heart away in an iron box, simply to survive. But the soft, gentle words of his mother, the image of that small, yellow porch light burning in the dark thousands of miles away, was the key that unlocked the box. The tears came suddenly, rising from a well of exhaustion and relief so deep he hadn't known it was there. They spilled over his dark lashes, tracking through the soot and dirt on his cheeks, falling silently onto the crisp white paper of the letter. He bowed his head, his shoulders shaking with quiet, breathless sobs. He was not alone. All across the ruined town of Bastogne, in the cellars, in the courtyards, and in the snowy fields, men were weeping. They were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. They were weeping for the friends who were not there to read their own letters. They were weeping for the sheer, terrifying realization of how close they had come to the edge, and for the beautiful, miraculous fact that they had been pulled back. The adrenaline that had kept their blood pumping for so many days was finally draining away, leaving them weak, fragile, and entirely human. In the center of the square, a medic who had worked tirelessly through the siege sat on the running board of an ambulance. He held a letter from his wife in one hand, and with the other, he covered his eyes, his chest heaving with silent, releasing sobs. A soldier from the relief column, a stranger who had just marched through the bitter frost to get here, walked over and sat down beside him. The soldier didn't ask what was wrong. He simply placed a heavy, warm arm around the medic's shoulders and pulled him close, offering the quiet, sturdy comfort of a brother. They sat there together as the snow began to gently fall once more. The tears falling into the snow that day were not a sign of weakness. They were the melting of the ice. They were the physical manifestation of a frozen spirit finally being allowed to thaw. As the afternoon deepened into evening, the frantic energy of the arrival slowly settled into a deep, peaceful quiet. The town was still in ruins. The winter was still fiercely cold. But the terror had been broken. The ghosts of isolation had been chased away by the smell of hot coffee, the sound of tearing envelopes, and the physical presence of men who had refused to let them fade into the dark. The men of Bastogne found places to sleep that night, wrapped in clean, dry blankets brought by the trucks. They lay down in the cellars and the barns, no longer keeping one ear tuned to the distant tree line. They tucked their letters carefully into their breast pockets, right over their beating hearts, holding the paper as if it were a talisman. Henry lay on a bed of fresh straw, pulling his new woolen blanket all the way up to his chin. He felt a profound, heavy exhaustion pulling at his limbs, but for the first time in a month, his mind was quiet. The constant, gnawing anxiety was gone. He listened to the soft murmurs of the men around him, the sound of breathing, the occasional shifting of a boot. He closed his eyes, and instead of the gray, terrifying mist of the forest, he saw the warm, yellow glow of a porch light, shining steadily in the dark. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the town, covering the tracks of the trucks, and gently burying the tears that had fallen upon the earth. But the cold could no longer reach them. They were tethered back to the world by words of love, by shared soup, and by the quiet, unshakable realization that they were safe. They drifted into a deep, restorative sleep, guarded by the friends who had crossed the frozen wilderness to find them, resting at last in the soft, whispered embrace of a winter night that had finally surrendered to the dawn. When the wind finally stops pushing against you, the hardest part is learning how to stand still. For so many long, bitter weeks, the bodies and minds of the men in Bastogne had been strung tight, humming like telegraph wires in a winter storm. They had lived on the razor's edge of adrenaline, their hearts beating a frantic, desperate rhythm just to keep the blood moving through their freezing limbs. They had been sustained by the sheer, unyielding necessity of survival. But now, as the heavy supply trucks sat parked in the town squares and the protective ring of the Third Army settled firmly around the perimeter, that invisible tension finally snapped. The silence that followed was not the terrifying, expectant quiet of a besieged forest. It was a heavy, exhausted sigh. It was the sound of 1,000 men simultaneously letting go of a breath they had been holding for a month. With the arrival of safety came the slow, inevitable fading of the adrenaline. And as that fierce, protective energy drained away, it left behind a profound, bone-weary exhaustion that was so deep it felt almost like a physical weight pressing them into the earth. It was a weariness that could not be cured by a single night of sleep or a single warm meal. It was an exhaustion of the soul. Imagine a soldier named Elias, a young man who had spent the last 2 weeks huddled in a shallow, frozen trench on the edge of the woods. He is sitting, now, inside the parlor of a half-ruined stone house. For the first time in what feels like a lifetime, there is a real fire burning in the hearth. The flames crackle and pop, casting a warm, dancing, amber light across the dust-covered floorboards. Elias is sitting in a worn, upholstered armchair. He doesn't lean back immediately. His body has forgotten how to relax against a soft surface. He sits perched on the edge, staring into the flames. Slowly, with stiff, clumsy fingers, he begins to unlace his boots. The leather is soaked through, frozen and thawed so many times it feels like wood. When he finally pulls the heavy boots from his feet, the sensation of the warm air hitting his damp, woolen socks is so intense it brings a sudden rush of tears to his eyes. As his body begins to thaw, a strange, beautiful agony sets in. The blood, finally free to return to his numb fingers and toes, brings with it a deep, throbbing ache. The ice that had caked the shoulders of his heavy coat begins to melt, dripping rhythmically onto the floor. Drip. 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 It is the sound of the winter finally loosening its grip. Elias closes his eyes, letting his head fall back against the cushioned chair. He does not fall asleep right away. He simply exists in the warmth, his mind drifting in a hazy, surreal space between the horrors of the forest and the incredible, undeniable reality of the fire. But as the physical ice melted away, another kind of thawing began to happen within the hearts of the men. When you are fighting for your life, there is no room for sorrow. Grief is a heavy thing to carry, and when you are already carrying a rifle, a pack, and the terrifying weight of the cold, you simply have to pack your grief away. You fold it up tight, bury it deep in your chest, and build a wall of ice around it so it cannot slow you down. Now, in the safety of the relieved town, the walls of ice were beginning to crack. In a quiet corner of a makeshift hospital, a medic named Samuel sat on a wooden crate, folding newly arrived, clean white bandages. The frantic rush of the siege was over. The wounded had been treated with real medicine, their pain finally dulled by the supplies brought by the trucks. The room was quiet, filled only with the soft, regular breathing of sleeping men. Samuel smoothed his hand over the soft cotton of a bandage, his movements slow and methodical. He looked across the room at an empty cot. Just yesterday, that cot had held a boy from a small farming town in Indiana, a boy who had talked to Samuel about his father's prize-winning horses. The boy had slipped away in the darkest hour of the night, before the sun broke through, before the relief columns arrived. Samuel didn't cry out. He didn't break down. The mourning of these men was a quiet, private reverence. He simply closed his eyes and let a few silent, heavy tears track down his face. He remembered the boy's voice. He remembered the way he had smiled when he talked about the summer fields. Samuel took that memory, gently unwrapped it from the ice of the siege, and placed it safely in the warmest part of his heart. It was a painful moment, but it was a necessary one. The tears were the proof that despite the brutality of the winter, their hearts had not turned to stone. They were still human, and they still loved the brothers they had lost. All across Bastogne, in the quiet hours of the afternoon, these silent vigils were taking place. Men walked softly through the snowy streets, searching the faces of the soldiers from other units, looking for a familiar smile, hoping against hope that a friend had made it through the storm. When they found each other, the reunions were hushed. Two men would stop in the middle of a cobblestone street, look at one another, and simply pull each other into a long, crushing embrace. No words were needed. The simple fact of their survival was enough. But when a question was asked, "Where is Thomas?" or "Have you seen Arthur?" and the answer was a slow, heartbreaking shake of the head, the shared silence that followed was incredibly heavy. They would stand together in the snow, looking down at their boots, giving the lost friend a moment of absolute, undivided respect. They mourned not with grand ceremonies or loud salutes, but with the quiet, devastating realization that the world would never again be exactly as it was. In a small, roofless church on the edge of the square, a soldier named William sat on a fallen stone pillar. The pale winter sun filtered down through the open rafters, casting long, peaceful shadows across the snow that blanketed the floor. William held a stub of a pencil and a piece of thin, blue paper resting on a wooden board across his knees. He was writing a letter. But he wasn't writing to his own mother, or his own wife. He was writing to the mother of a boy who had slept in the foxhole next to his. It is the heaviest burden a soldier can carry, to be the one to send the dark news home. William stared at the blank paper for a long time, the pencil hovering in his trembling hand. How do you summarize a life in a few short sentences? How do you cushion a blow that will surely break a mother's heart? He decided to write about the light. "Dear Mrs. Higgins," he wrote, his handwriting slow and careful. "I am writing to tell you about your son, Leo. I want you to know that he was the bravest boy I have ever met. But more than that, I want you to know that he was kind. In the coldest nights, he was the one who always made sure we had a fire. He was the one who shared his rations when the food ran low. He talked about you every day. He talked about your garden and the way the kitchen smelled on Sunday mornings. He carried your love with him, and it kept him warm. I was with him at the end. He was not alone. We held him, and he was at peace." William stopped, his vision blurring. A tear fell onto the blue paper, blooming into a small, dark circle near Leo's name. William didn't wipe it away. He let it dry, a physical piece of his own grief sent across the ocean, a shared sorrow to tell a mother that her son was loved by the men who walked beside him. He folded the letter carefully, sealing it with a quiet prayer. It was an act of profound, everyday heroism, the courage to face the pain, to honor the fallen, and to ensure that a mother knew the beauty of her son's final days. As the day slowly faded into a gentle, lavender twilight, the atmosphere in the town felt entirely different than the nights before. The oppressive, terrifying silence of the siege had been replaced by the soft, comforting sounds of a world returning to life. There was the sound of axes biting into wood, as men chopped firewood without the fear of the smoke drawing artillery fire. There was the sound of water boiling in large metal pots, preparing a warm evening meal. There was the soft murmur of voices, rising from the cellars and the parlors, no longer constrained to desperate whispers, but speaking in the normal, rhythmic cadence of men telling stories and sharing memories. The civilians of Bastogne, the brave people who had shared their homes and their cellars with the trapped men, also began to emerge. Madame Gervais, the older woman with the kind eyes, stood on her front stoop with a broom, slowly sweeping the dust and snow from the threshold. It was a mundane task, an ordinary chore, but in the aftermath of the battle, it was a beautiful assertion of life. She was reclaiming her home. She was telling the winter that it had not won. Soldiers passing by tipped their helmets to her, offering gentle, exhausted smiles. She nodded back, her eyes crinkling with a quiet, enduring grace. They had survived the dark together, an unbreakable bond forged in the freezing cellars beneath the stone. The night fell, wrapping the town in a blanket of stars. The air was still bitterly cold, but the chill no longer held the sharp, terrifying bite of the unknown. The perimeter was secure. The sentries still stood watch in the snowy woods, but they stood with the confidence of men backed by an entire army. Inside the houses and the barns, the men of the Third Army and the defenders of Bastogne lay down to sleep. They pulled their new, dry blankets up to their chins. They let their tired muscles uncoil. And in the quiet of the night, as the fires burned low in the hearths, the thawing hearts finally found their rest. They dreamed not of the snow, or the smoke, or the terrifying noise of the struggle. They dreamed of the faces they had lost, seeing them young, smiling, and bathed in a golden, summer light. They held those memories close, keeping them safe, knowing that the greatest tribute they could offer to those left behind in the snow was simply to live. To breathe in the crisp morning air. To appreciate the warmth of a fire. And to walk forward into the future, carrying the love of their fallen brothers with them, a quiet, eternal flame that the winter could never, ever put out. The immediate aftermath was a time of heavy exhaustion and gentle tears, but it was also a time of profound healing. The ice was breaking. The hearts were thawing. And in the peaceful, starlit quiet of Bastogne, the long, terrible night was finally, truly over. Even the deepest, most terrible winter must eventually surrender to the gentle, inevitable breath of spring. There is a day in the turning of the year when the air changes its mind. It doesn't happen with a sudden burst of heat or a dramatic clearing of the sky. It happens in a whisper. The wind, which had howled with the bitter, biting fury of the Arctic, softens into a cool, damp breeze that carries the unmistakable, earthy scent of wet soil and sleeping roots. In the battered, bruised forests of the Ardennes, this change was not just a shift in the weather. It was a pardon. It was the world breathing a long, slow sigh of relief, signaling to the weary man and the broken town that the great freeze was finally losing its grip. If you stood in the center of Bastogne on that first truly gentle morning, you would hear a sound that had been entirely absent for weeks. It was the sound of water. All across the town, the thick, heavy shells of ice that had clung so desperately to the shattered slate roofs were beginning to yield. They melted drop by drop, creating a quiet, musical rhythm as the water fell into the cobblestone streets below. Drip. Drop. Drip. It sounded like 1,000 tiny clocks ticking away the final hours of the siege. The snow, which had been a blinding, suffocating ocean of white, began to recede, pulling back its edges to reveal the dark, rich earth beneath. For the soldiers of the Third Army, and the brave boys who had held the line in the dark, this physical thawing was mirrored by a deep, internal release. They could feel the tension leaving their muscles, draining away with the melting snow. Imagine a young soldier named Thomas, sitting on the tailgate of a resting supply truck. He has finally taken off his heavy, woolen coat, letting the pale, golden sunlight wash over his shoulders. For the first time in over a month, he is not shivering. He looks down at his hands. They are scarred, the knuckles red and rough from the cold, but they are warm. He rubs his palms together, simply marveling at the friction, at the simple, miraculous sensation of his own blood flowing freely through his veins. Thomas pulls a piece of paper from his shirt pocket. It is the last letter he will write from this place. His handwriting is no longer the jagged, frantic scrawl of a boy trying to capture a memory before his match burns out. It is steady, slow, and full of grace. Dear Mother, he writes, resting the paper on his knee. The sky is clear today. I saw a bird this morning, a little brown sparrow, sitting on the edge of a ruined wall. It was singing. I think we are all going to be all right now. We are packing our bags. We are moving on. But I wanted you to know that the winter didn't win. I am safe, and I am coming home. He folds the letter carefully, sealing it with a profound sense of peace. He knows that when his mother opens this envelope, she won't smell the smoke or the frost. She will only feel the quiet relief of a promise kept. As the days grew slightly longer and the earth continued to soften, the time came for the men from the warm valleys of the south, the giants who had carved their way through the ice, to leave the town they had saved. Their journey was not over, but their time in the frozen island of Bastogne had come to an end. The departure was not marked by grand parades or the loud, brassy blare of marching bands. The heroes of this story were far too tired for fanfare, and the townspeople were far too moved for simple cheers. The goodbyes were intimate, whispered in the doorways and the courtyards that had once been the front lines of the world. In the small, cobbled square, a young tank driver named Elias stood beside his massive iron machine. The tank was splashed with mud now, the winter camouflage fading into the brown of the coming spring. Standing before him was Madame Céline, the elderly woman who had shared her cellar, her torn linens, and her quiet prayers with the wounded. She held a small, beautifully carved wooden bird in her hands. It was a simple thing, whittled from a piece of pine, its wings smoothed by years of touch. She pressed it into Elias's large, calloused hand, closing his thick fingers around it with her own fragile ones. She spoke in French, her voice a soft, melodious hum. Elias didn't understand the exact words, but he understood the cadence. He understood the profound, overwhelming gratitude in her eyes. It was the look of a mother who had watched strangers walk through a blizzard to keep her children breathing. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, embroidered patch from his uniform, a bright, colorful insignia that he had carried since he left home. He handed it to her, a small piece of his own history, a token to say, I was here. We stood together. He tipped his helmet to her, a gentle, respectful nod, and climbed back into his machine. As the long column of trucks and tanks slowly rumbled out of the town, winding their way down the muddy roads toward the east, Madame Céline stood in the square, holding the bright patch against her heart, watching until the very last olive-drab vehicle disappeared into the trees. The soldiers left, taking their iron and their canvas with them, but they left behind a town forever changed. As the spring truly took hold, Bastogne began to heal. The healing of a town is much like the healing of a body. It is slow, it requires patience, and it leaves scars. The sound of artillery was replaced by the rhythmic, purposeful strike of hammers against nails, and the scrape of trowels spreading fresh mortar. Neighbors helped neighbors clear the rubble from their gardens, unearthing the dormant bulbs of tulips and daffodils that had slept safely beneath the frost. The cellars, those dark, vaulted sanctuaries that had held the wounded and the terrified, were slowly emptied of their makeshift beds. They were scrubbed clean with cold water and strong soap, opening their small windows to let the fresh, pine-scented breeze sweep away the stale air of the siege. They went back to holding potatoes, and cider, and the quiet dust of ordinary life. But the memory of the winter remained. It settled into the very stones of the village. If you walk through the forests of the Ardennes today, long after the snows of that terrible December have melted into the earth, you will find a profound and beautiful quiet. The ancient pine trees still reach toward the sky, their branches swaying gently in the wind. The sunlight filters down through the green canopy, casting dappled, golden patterns on the soft, mossy ground. It looks like any other peaceful forest in the world. But the legacy of the struggle is there. It is etched not just in the brass plaques or the grand stone monuments that stand in the town squares. The true monument is invisible. It is woven into the enduring, quiet peace of the place. It lives in the stories told by grandfathers to wide-eyed children, sitting by a warm hearth on a cold winter night. They tell the tale of the year the sky turned to ice, and the world was swallowed by the dark. They speak of the brave boys who held the line with empty hands, and the giants who drove their metal beasts through the blizzard to bring the dawn. They tell these stories in soft, hushed tones, passing down a legacy of resilience, of brotherhood, and of the incredible power of human kindness. The everyday heroism of that winter is remembered in the way a neighbor shares a loaf of bread. It is remembered in the way a stranger is welcomed in from the cold. It is remembered in the quiet reverence the townspeople hold for the woods that surround them, a silent acknowledgement that the earth they walk upon was once a place of profound sacrifice. There is a small cemetery just outside the town, where the grass grows thick and green in the summer, and the white markers stand in perfect, quiet rows. When the spring rains come, washing the marble clean, it is a place of absolute serenity. The boys who rest there never got to see the snow melt. They never got to feel the warmth of the Belgian sun on their faces, or write that final letter home. But because of them, the town survived. Because of their quiet resilience, their private fears swallowed down for the sake of the man next to them, the ring was broken. They gave their tomorrows so that the people of this small, stone village could have their today. And the village does not forget. When the first snowdrops push their delicate, white heads through the thawing mud, they are greeted with a quiet, knowing smile. They are a reminder that no matter how harsh the winter, life will always find a way to return. Light will always pierce the dark. And love, that fragile, invisible thread that binds a mother's letter to a freezing foxhole, will always outlast the storm. As the sun sets over the Ardennes, painting the sky in soft shades of peach and lavender, the shadows of the pine trees stretch long and peaceful across the fields. The air is cool, but it is a gentle cool, promising a restful night. The frantic, terrifying energy of the past is gone, replaced by the slow, steady rhythm of a world at peace. Imagine yourself walking down one of those quiet, dirt roads, the sound of your footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The forest around you is calm. A small red bird flits from branch to branch, its evening song a sweet, delicate melody that drifts through the twilight. You can let out a long, slow breath. The journey is over. The heavy coats can be put away. The fires can burn down to soft, glowing embers. The boys in olive will have finished their march, and the watchers in the cellar have finally closed their eyes to sleep without fear. The winter of iron and ice has faded into the pages of history, leaving behind only the profound, beautiful grace of a quiet spring. The world is safe. The light has returned. And here, in the gentle embrace of the trees, all is finally, wonderfully, and eternally still. Rest now, knowing the dawn has come, and the woods are at peace.